FBI during the last administration and the way they mishandled this counterintelligence investigation. I think the rank and file agents in the FBI and their colleagues in the intelligence community need to know that we are there for them and support them in the faithful discharge of their responsibilities. I happen to have the privilege of serving on the Intelligence Committee and the Judiciary Committee, and I like to think that there is no more ardent supporter of our law enforcement agencies or our intelligence community than I am. And I believe that General Hayden, when he wrote his book about his experience at the CIA, had it right. It was called Playing to the Edge. Playing to the edge of your authorities, not over the line, but up to the edge in the interest of our national security. But I think that also makes it important for us to root out illegality, mendacity, deception in the exercise of the authorities that are given to our intelligence community. And so let me ask you a little bit about that. Because I can't think of anything more damaging to the intelligence community, the FBI and the DOJ, than what you have uncovered in this 400-page report and what we've seen here. It really is very troubling. Can I ask you, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, as you have pointed out, considers the application of a foreign intelligence surveillance for a warrant by the FBI working with the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. Do you believe if the court knew what you know now, that it would have ever issued the FISA warrant in the first place?
You know, we're careful not to predict what federal judges would do, presented with the evidence, and whether there would be sufficient basis to find probable cause. I know that they would not sign a warrant if they were told not all.
By the FBI, working with the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. Do you believe if the court knew what you know now, that it would have ever issued the FISA warrant in the first place?
You know, we're careful not to predict what federal judges would do, presented with the evidence, and whether there would be sufficient basis to find probable cause. I know that they would not sign a warrant if they were told not all relevant information was included in it.
Or if they were lied to.
And certainly if they were lied to.
And do you know whether the court is currently considering this matter?
Well, I know the court, based on discussions with folks at NSD, at the National Security Division, that they have the report and that they have a follow-on letter from the department about this matter.
Well, I hope they will not let this pass, because if this misbehavior, this illegality, this deception becomes a routine, I agree with Senator Graham that it will be the end of the authorities that Congress has granted under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which I think would be very damaging to our national security. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act includes the word surveillance, obviously, and you can't surveil an American citizen for intelligence purposes except under very specialized and exacting circumstances. Would you agree with that?
That's correct.
Because the rights given to an American citizen under the U.S. Constitution are laid out in the Bill of Rights, among other places, and there is a higher standard with regard to getting a warrant, let's say, to wiretap or to investigate an American citizen than there would be a foreign agent, correct?
That's correct. There's particularly sensitive circumstances around surveilling a U.S. person.
So the whole exception here, which authorized by which the court authorized the surveillance of Mr. Page, was based on some proof or some indication, some suspicion he was an agent of a foreign power, correct?
Correct. They had to show probable cause to believe he was an agent of a foreign power.
But as you pointed out, they got incomplete and misleading information in that process. Agreed?
The court got inaccurate, incomplete information. Agreed.
So what's the difference between surveillance and spying?
Well, surveillance, and the term I'm going to use and we use in the report, is what's in the law, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
You don't like the vernacular?
I'm going to stick to what we do as IGs, which is look at the law and stick to what the language is in the law.
Well, to my mind, there's really no difference. Although it's legally authorized, according to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, it's an active covert intelligence gathering against here a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power. Let me ask you about the defensive briefing.
Yep.
And you've explained in response to Senator Graham's questions the difference between a counterintelligence investigation and a criminal investigation. And I believe at some point during the last few years, I remember Loretta Lynch, the former Attorney General, say that defensive briefings were routine in counterintelligence investigations. Would you agree with that?
You know, I frankly don't have enough experience with them on the national security side to tell you one way or the other.
You don't have.
I've heard that be said, but I don't know specifically.
You don't have any reason to disagree with?
No reason to disagree.
Okay. So if they are routine, if Attorney General Lynch is correct, the decision by Mr. Priestap, the head of the counterintelligence division of the FBI, not to provide an extensive counterintelligence briefing, defensive briefing to candidate Trump and his campaign would be unusual.
If it's usual, then not doing it, yes, I agree, would be unusual.
What was even more unusual is the fact that when the Director of National Intelligence went to provide what turned out to be a perfunctory briefing to the Trump campaign, lasted about 13 minutes, I think you indicated in your report, that they had implanted into that group an agent, FBI agent that was part of the investigative team for a crossfire hurricane. Is that correct?
That's correct. The agent, there was one FBI agent there, and they chose the agent from the counterintelligence investigation.
So instead of their mission being to provide candidate Trump and his campaign, to arm them with information so that they could prevent the Russians from infiltrating their campaign, this briefing, such as it was, had a dual purpose. The agent, it says on page 342 of your report, actually prepared himself going through mock briefings headed by Stroke, Lisa Page, the Intel section chief, and possibly the general counsel unit chief, correct?
That's correct.
So this was not just an incidental sort of thing. Obviously, there were plans made for the agent to go in as part of this defensive briefing and perhaps get General Flynn to inadvertently offer information that might be helpful to the FBI in their investigation.
Yeah, and as explained to us, it was dual purpose. One, to see if anything was said during the briefing in response to the briefing that would be useful for crossfire hurricane purposes immediately, but also, as the agents told us, for purposes of a future interview of Mr. Flynn, which did in fact occur later.
And so Mr. Flynn was clearly the target.
He was certainly, of the three people there from the Trump campaign, the only one of the three who was a subject of an FBI investigation at the time.
And he wasn't told that he was under investigation or that the agent was there hoping to bait him into providing incriminatory information, and the agent didn't provide him any declaration or admonishment of his Miranda rights, correct?
He certainly wasn't told there was a dual purpose to the briefing.
Well, it looks to me like Director Wray was so concerned about this that he's, as you pointed out, said that this will never happen again.
That's right.
Is that what you said?
That's correct.
So let me ask you, Mr. Horowitz, are you familiar with the fact that Director Comey had a meeting with President Trump in January of 2017 to talk to him about the Steele dossier?
I am, and we actually referenced that in our report about his preparation and handling of the memos that came out of that meeting.
Why should we believe that Director Comey's so-called defensive briefing, if you want to call it that, of the president in January 2017 was anything more than an attempt to try to bait the president into providing incriminatory information which would be useful to the FBI in its counterintelligence investigation or potentially some future criminal investigation?
I have no information one way or the other to make a judgment on that, but as mentioned earlier, one of the concerns with doing that here is that it leaves open the possibility that people might ask, did it happen elsewhere?
Well, it strikes me as fraught with danger, just like it was for General Flynn, for the director to go into the White House, the Oval Office in the White House, not to tell the president that anything he says could be used against him in an ongoing investigation.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And picking up on that editorial comment, I've been joining Senator Leahy and Senator Lee for years talking about this FISA court. Yep. And we now have an ample record here in this case and in a lot of others. 2002, the FISA court identified more than 75 cases in which it was misled by the FBI. Internal FBI review in 2006, dozens of inaccuracies provided to the FISA court. The list goes on and on. So let's have a fulsome conversation after this about the future of the FISA court and the representations that are made to it. Let me try, if I can, Mr. Horowitz, thank you and your team for being here, to go through a few points. The chairman gave an uncharacteristic, flowery, heated opening that went on for some 40 minutes and produced a lengthy record of emails from Lisa Page and Peter Strzok, which repeatedly demonstrated statements of hostility toward candidate Donald Trump. He went on to say these were the people in charge. When I read your summary of your findings, you didn't find either of them to be in charge, did you?
On this investigation, we did not.
Okay. When it comes to expletives, you also, on page 339 of your report, found some agents at the FBI who had an exactly opposite political viewpoint. Correct. And were very positive toward candidate Trump and very open in their use of expletives to demonstrate that.
Yeah. And those individuals, to be clear, were not part of the Crossfire Hurricane team, but were in a different field office interacting with the Crossfire Hurricane team.
And I hope we can all concede the point. We don't believe anyone in this capacity, this delicate capacity with life-changing decision-making every single day, should be so politically biased as to call into question their values and their character.
That's correct, and I made this point last year when this issue came up. Individuals at the Justice Department and the FBI are allowed to have their political views. They're allowed to be voters. They're allowed to be engaged citizens. They should be. They can't, though, tie their personal views to their investigative acts.
And I'm sure that's one of the things you've shared with Director Wray.
Correct.
All right. Also, the chairman made a point early on of talking about the fact that the Trump campaign was not notified of this ongoing investigation until a much later date after it had been initiated. And I would just say, be careful what you wish for, because there are those of us who look at the James Comey October 28th public declaration about the Hillary Clinton investigation as being deadly in terms of the outcome of this election. So this notion of the FBI publicizing investigations, making them known to many people, can cut both ways. It's good to know, I'm sure, but you run the risk that as more people come to know it, it becomes public knowledge. Is that an issue?
Yeah, look, we wrote the last year's report about that concern of what Director Comey did in that regard, and you obviously want to control information and make sure only the people actually need to know it.
So the point I'm trying to get to is the chairman's opening suggested a bias, at least in this instance, at the FBI and others, against Donald Trump that he believes was manifest in many of the things that followed. I could argue from our side of the table, we can find bias that includes Comey's statements, public statements right before the election that really had, in many of our points of view, determinative outcome. Let me go back to the irrepressible, ever-present Rudolph Giuliani, because here's something. During the 2016 campaign, Rudy Giuliani, who was then a Trump campaign surrogate, bragged about having access to information about the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails. Right. He teased in October 2016 that a surprise was coming. And on November 4th, after Director Comey sent his letter reopening the investigation, Giuliani said, and I quote, "I had expected this. Did I hear about it? You're darn right I heard about it," the mayor said. So how can we be dealing with those kinds of statements that long ago and still not have some resolution as to whether or not he was just bluffing or, in fact, he had moles in that New York office? If I remember right, one of Comey's rationales for his public announcement was, I couldn't do it through the New York office because it leaks like a sieve. Is there no investigation, or has there been no investigation of this?
So, as I mentioned last year when we released our report on the Clinton email investigation, we are looking at still that question. And the challenge of that investigation, as I mentioned back then, I'll mention again, is proving who spoke to whom and when based on records at the FBI, and understanding that there's rarely going to be substantive information we will get, for example, from toll records or others, but we will find out context, and we're trying to follow up. We're continuing to do that. We've issued 2 reports so far about findings we had of leaks and misconduct, and we have investigations ongoing.
Mr. Giuliani now professes to be President Trump's lawyer, and occasionally the president acknowledges that. Sometimes he doesn't. Are there any concerns that Mr. Giuliani may be continuing to improperly obtain information from sources in law enforcement not authorized to provide it?
I'm not going to speak to what we've learned or what we know about what our ongoing investigations, and I'm not investigating matters related to the ongoing Ukraine issues that I think you're referencing.
Let me ask, if I can, on this question of the problems within this case, particularly as they relate to the treatment of individuals who are engaged in it. And I'm thinking particularly of the ongoing questions about whether or not one particular individual was treated fairly here. Is it your conclusion that Mr. Page was not a Russian agent? Or I should say, did not have important contacts that were not in the best interests of the United States with the Russian leadership?
I'm not in a position to assess that. What I can assess is looking at the evidence that the FBI put forward to the FISA court. A significant number of pieces of that evidence do not support their theory of the case. And that was never told to Justice Department lawyers, who are the ones who are the gatekeepers and have to be able to know that information to make that decision. They're the experts, not me.
Could we speak for a moment to the Steele dossier, Steele file in this case? I believe you had a pretty definitive statement about what impact that Steele file had on the initiation of this investigation. What was your conclusion?
In terms of the initiation of the investigation, it had no impact.
No impact.
No impact. It was not known to the team that opened the investigation at the time they opened it.
So you've concluded in several different ways that there's no evidence of political influence for the opening of this Crossfire Hurricane investigation. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. Let's see if there's anything else here. On this FISA reform issue, I'll get back to that later, but one thing that's interesting here, and Senator Lee is not with us at this moment, he's introduced a bill which I'm co-sponsoring, which would give the Inspector General's office, in this circumstance, the authority to investigate attorneys.
Correct.
In the department. Right now, that's not allowed under the law, is it?
That's correct. It is not. And thank you for co-sponsoring the bill, as have several other members of the committee.
It seems to me to be obvious. Do you know what the theory is behind their being separate and not subject to this investigation?
This is a legacy of history. Back in 1988, when the IG was created at Justice, the compromise was that attorneys would be carved out. By the way, so was the FBI and DEA at the time, and that we would have jurisdiction over everybody else. After the Aldrich Ames spy scandal, Attorney General Ashcroft actually changed that and gave us the authority over DEA and FBI. Congress codified it in 2002, but attorneys still a carve-out. We're the only IG that can't review conduct of all the employees in our organization, including attorneys.
And Attorney General Ashcroft was authorized to give you that kind of option?
Under the statute as it then existed, he had the authority to do that. The statutory change took that away.
Mr. Chairman, I hope you'll consider that when we're putting together an agenda. Thank you for your service.
Thank you. And I will go to, I think, Senator Sass, but just 30 seconds here. Has anybody been charged with working with the Russians, illegally working with the Russians that were part of the Trump campaign that you know of?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I find the conclusion that some have raised that your report, Mr. Horowitz, somehow exonerates the FBI in this matter to be crazy. Absolutely crazy. To the point that it almost makes me wonder whether those who are making this argument have read the same report that we're talking about today. Perhaps they're talking about a different report. There is no planet on which I think this report indicates that things were okay within the FBI in connection with this investigation. They most certainly were not. And yet, stunningly, former FBI Director Jim Comey took to the pages of the Washington Post to declare that this report, your report, shows that, quote, the FBI fulfilled its mission protecting the American people and upholding the U.S. Constitution. I don't understand that. I find it absolutely stunning that he would reach that conclusion. This is nonsense. I don't care where you fit on the political spectrum. If you are a politician or if you are a non-politician, if you are a liberal or a conservative, a Republican, a Democrat, regardless of your age, your views, you should be deeply concerned about what's in your report, Mr. Horowitz. This report is a scathing indictment of the FBI, of the agents that were involved, and I want to be clear about that because the FBI is an institution that has a long history of respect in this country. And as a federal prosecutor, I worked with the FBI. I found many of its agents to be people of utmost integrity and thoroughness. And that's part of why I'm so concerned by your report and its findings, the facts stated therein. It's because I think this really damages that. There is a lot of good in this country that comes not just from the FBI being good, but also being understood to be good. The behavior outlined in your report is, at a minimum, so negligent. I actually would say so reckless that it calls into question the legitimacy of the entire FISA program. And I don't say that lightly. I say this, of course, as someone who has long questioned the FISA program and how it could be abused, but this really pushes us over the edge. I'll get back to that in a minute. The report concludes, way too generously in my view, that the report, quote, did not find documentary or testimonial evidence of intentional misconduct on the part of the case agents who were involved in investigating the Trump campaign. But the report goes on to call the conduct of the agents and the supervisors involved to be, quote, serious performance failures, which you noted were failures for which you did not receive a satisfactory explanation. Is that right?
That's correct.
Serious performance failures. Failures without any type of satisfactory explanation. This is the failure that Jim Comey astoundingly, stunningly, irresponsibly considers a fulfilled mission, a mission that includes, among other things, protecting the constitutional rights of the American people? I think not. This is what the former head of the FBI considers protecting the American people and upholding the Constitution. I just can't understand it. It's simply not good enough. It may be good enough for Mr. Comey. It's not good enough for the American people. Every American really should be terrified by this report. The FBI team that investigated the Trump campaign was, as has been pointed out, handpicked. After all, it couldn't and wouldn't and wasn't the case that they would just pick any ordinary investigators to investigate a presidential campaign, especially the presidential campaign of one of the two major party nominees, for what was acknowledged in the report to have been one of the most sensitive FBI investigations. These agents were supposed to have been the best of the best, and we wouldn't expect anything less in that circumstance. They were supposed to be of the highest character and professionalism, committed to protecting the civil liberties of all Americans. You see, our privacy is not at odds with our security. Our privacy is inextricably intertwined with, and indeed an inseparable part of our security. We cannot be secure unless our privacy is also guaranteed. We certainly can't be secure in our Republican form of government if, after all, our Republican form of government is imperiled by people who choose to politicize the intelligence gathering and law enforcement apparatus that our federal government has. So we're faced with two possibilities. Either one, these FBI agents purposely used the power of the federal government to wage a political war against a presidential candidate they despised, or two, these agents were so incompetent that they allowed a paid foreign political operative to weaponize the FISA program into a spying operation on a rival presidential political campaign. I'm not sure about you, but I'm not sure which one is worse. I am sure that neither conclusion is acceptable. They're both horrifying for slightly different reasons. I'm not sure there is a substantive distinction between the two of them. I'm not sure one can conclude, I'm not sure it's possible to conclude that the bias evident in communications between some of these investigators wasn't at least a part of it. Now, the fact that you say that there wasn't a causal connection between them, that there wasn't a sine qua non with but-for causal chain between those communications and the opening of the investigation itself is beside the point. The fact is, these were agents who made their bias clear, and they went after someone in part because they did not like his candidacy, and that's inexcusable. The report in the FBI's abuse, I believe it's longstanding abuse, I believe it's inevitable abuse of FISA and the FISA court to surveil American citizens, should, in a sense, not be of tremendous surprise to us. James Madison warned us against this very kind of thing in Federalist 51 when he said if men were angels, they wouldn't need a government. If we had access to angels to govern us, we wouldn't need rules about government. But alas, we are not angels. We don't have access to angels to govern us. And so we have to have auxiliary precautions. We have to have checks and balances to make sure that no one person or no one entity gets too much power. And added to those checks and balances, we also have substantive limitations, like the Fourth Amendment. We have things that are there to protect us. I've believed for some time, as has been noted earlier in this hearing, and I've teamed up with people at the opposite end of the political ideological spectrum, that FISA carries with it an unacceptable risk of abuse. That's why I've teamed up with Senator Pat Leahy over the last 9 years that I've served in the Senate and on the Senate Judiciary Committee, because I believe these programs are subject to abuse. I've been warning for years that inevitably these would result in abuse. It's not a question of if, but it's when and how soon will government officials get caught doing it. It actually surprises me in some ways that it took us this long to find an instance where you get caught. But then again, that is what happens. When you take a standard that is malleable, that requires virtually no public accountability, you render all but a small handful of Intelligence Committee lawmakers in the House and in the Senate, you render all other citizens other than them and other than the intel community itself ineligible to review their work. And then you make it possible for them to gather information. This kind of thing is, of course, going to happen. It's never not going to happen. And that scares me to death. Now, Inspector General Horowitz, you've stated several times today, both in your opening statement and in response to questions, that you did not find documentary testimonial evidence of bias that influenced the FBI's decision to conduct these operations. But Mr. Horowitz, is not the lack of evidence that you're talking about itself evidence of bias? Isn't the lack of evidence on bias evidence that we really should take as bias? But it's, in any event, it's certainly not itself indicative that no bias occurred. Isn't that correct?
As to the opening, which is in a different place than the FISA issues that you've identified and I talked about earlier, I think it's two very different situations. On the FISA side, we found, as you noted, a lack of documentary testimony evidence about intentionality, but we also noted the lack of satisfactory explanations and, in fact, leave open the possibility that, for the reasons you indicated, it's unclear what the motivations were. On the one hand, gross incompetence, negligence. On the other hand, intentionality, and where in between, we weren't in a position to, with the evidence we had, to make that conclusion.
My point
I'm
is,
not ruling it out.
your lack of evidence here is not evidence that there was no bias.
I'm solely basing it, correct, on the actual evidence that we have.
Thank you very much.
But, Mr. Horowitz, you actually did make a finding on that very question, did you not? I direct you to page 14 of the executive summary, where you ascribe this to management and supervisory failures that were not specific to this case, but that were potentially endemic. Is that not correct?
I'm sorry, on the FISA side?
Yep, you say that so many basic and fundamental errors
Yes.
were made by 3 separate handpicked teams on one of the
Correct.
most sensitive FBI investigations, raises significant questions regarding the FBI chain of command's management and supervision of the FISA
Correct.
process. You then go on to describe it as a failure of managers and supervisors.
Right.
And you go on to say that your remedy is an OIG audit, not only of this case, but of other cases that have nothing
Correct.
to do with the Trump campaign, nothing
Correct.
to do with politics. So you actually do make a finding about this, and that is that you attribute the failure here to a failure of management and supervision that could well go beyond this particular case.
Correct, although not just managers and supervisors, obviously. All the line people who had responsibility,
They
the
made errors,
prosecutors,
too.
they made very serious errors.
But you make no finding that this was attributable to a deep state conspiracy or a political conspiracy or any such type of motivation.
We make no finding. We explain in there that we did not have documentary or testimonial evidence that it was intentional. We also point out the lack of satisfactory explanations. And from there, I can't draw any further conclusions.
Correct. Other than you do, what you go with is that there was a failure of management and supervision over this complicated process that needs to be repaired.
From top to bottom.
Correct. Now, when did the Attorney General, what's the timeline on the Attorney General getting notice of this report? How long did it take between when he first saw this and when he credited this? He said that your investigation is a credit to the Department of Justice.
Well, we first provided the draft report for classification marking purposes right at the beginning of September, end of August, beginning of September.
So he and his team have had it for over a month, well over a month.
Yeah, and then we got it back from them with the markings. We did the normal process in a classified review. We then incorporated the
director-
markings, then produced it back in November for the factual
And the
accuracy.
director of the FBI would have
Same
had
thing.
access to it during that time frame?
Same exact time frame.
Same exact time frame. And he complimented you on its thoroughness and professionalism and says that he accepts the report's findings, correct? With plenty of time to review it.
Correct.
Now, then we get to Mr. Durham. Did Mr. Durham have access to this report during that same period of time?
No, we did not give it to him in the end of August and September, precisely because it was for classification purposes. He had no reason to see it.
Yep.
We were very careful as to who could see it and who couldn't.
Yep.
We had the department keep lists of who could see it and who couldn't see it to
He was
control
not
it.
on the list?
He was not on the list. We provided to him in November
Yep.
as part of our factual accuracy
November
review.
when, do you remember?
I could check, but it was probably roughly mid-November.
So are you familiar with what he is undertaking at all?
I'm somewhat, but not, I wouldn't pretend to be completely familiar with it.
He notes that he does not agree with some of your report's conclusions as to predication and how the FBI case was opened. what information do you think he has access to that you did not have access to?
I have no idea.
When you look at Director Wray's letter, he says that his organization, the FBI, provided broad and timely access to all information requested by the OIG, including highly classified and sensitive material. And he accepts that the Crossfire Hurricane investigation was done for an authorized purpose and with adequate factual predication. I'm trying to figure out where the world of evidence exists about predication that you didn't have access to and that FBIA Director Wray would not have access to. Where could John Durham be going for information that is outside of the scope of what you have access to or what FBI Director Wray has access to?
I don't know, and you'd have to ask the Attorney General or Mr. Durham.
I mean, hypothetically, is there some area of evidence that you're aware of that you didn't get access to?
We are not. We got 1 million records. We asked the FBI for all of the materials in their possession, including from other agencies.
Does he have a grand jury operating, do you know?
I have no idea, and I couldn't say if I knew.
Is he going overseas to debrief foreign agents and interests?
I have no idea. You'd have to talk with him.
Okay. Predication involves a threshold, does it not?
Correct. For opening an investigation.
Yeah. And when you've hit your predication threshold, more evidence doesn't, as long as the evidence is adequate, more evidence doesn't take it away, correct?
Correct.
So I'm also trying to figure out how it is that even if he had more evidence that you did not have, that takes away from your conclusion that predication was adequate.
Again, I think you'd have to ask him or the Attorney General.
You can't think of a way to get there, can you?
I don't know. As I said earlier, we stand by our findings.
So you describe serious performance failures in the FISA process. Those are likely to lead to either disciplinary actions or to sanctions by the court, or at least be considered for those things, correct?
Those are certainly two of the options, yes.
Yes. And in that process, those individuals will have a chance to defend themselves. There's due process involved.
Right. We are not the adjudicators. That goes to the department, the court, or any other entities that might.
So we may find out more as those processes go forward in that context.
Correct, you might.
Okay. Now let's look at the intelligence briefing. At the time of that intelligence briefing, what did the FBI know about how far Russian interests had penetrated into the Trump campaign?
I don't know, as I sit here, the level and extent of the FBI's knowledge. We were looking at the origins of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation in these 4 cases.
But the FBI clearly knew that there was an investigation going on because it was their investigation.
Yes, and we lay out here some of what they knew. I just can't sit here and tell you other than
Carter Page, correct?
I'm sorry?
They knew the concerns about Carter Page, and he was associated with the Trump campaign.
Correct.
They knew they had an investigation going on into Michael Flynn at the time.
Correct.
Do you know if they knew about the Trump Tower meeting 2 months before the intelligence briefing with the Russian agents?
I don't know one way or the other.
Okay. And going into it, it would be reasonable, wouldn't it, to expect that the FBI did not then know how far Russian penetration into the Trump campaign went?
I have no idea at what stage their investigation was at that point in time. I have no reason to doubt what you're saying, but I don't know independently.
So there was no way that they could rule out that people present at the intelligence briefing on behalf of the Trump campaign might have actually been involved in the Russian operation.
I have no knowledge of that. All I know as to that is they had the open investigation on Mr. Flynn.
Yeah. So they certainly couldn't rule out when he was actually in that briefing that
as
he
I
was
said,
a potential participant in the matter that they were looking into.
Yeah, and as I said, Senator, Crossfire Hurricane was bigger than just the pieces we were looking at, so I can't sit here and tell you what else the FBI may or may not have known at the time.
So while we can agree that putting Crossfire Hurricane agent into the intelligence briefing of the Trump campaign might have been over-aggressive, for the FBI to be in that intelligence briefing would be perfectly appropriate, correct?
In fact, absolutely appropriate for them to be there. That was the debate that went on internally at the FBI, which is what to do, and they never, which they did not discuss either with anyone at the department, the appropriateness of it, or at ODNI. It was the DNI's.
But there was no reason the FBI shouldn't have been in that briefing.
The FBI should have been at that briefing
Precisely.
for intelligence purposes.
For intelligence purposes.
To give an intelligence briefing.
And it also would have been perfectly appropriate for a Crossfire Hurricane agent to have debriefed the FBI agent present at the intelligence briefing to see if Michael Flynn had said anything relevant to the investigation, or anybody else for that matter. It was information potentially relevant to the investigation, was it not?
Depending what occurred there, you could foresee a hypothetical where that occurred. I think it raises serious policy questions that, frankly, the FBI director needs to sort through and understand with leadership at the department, because that briefing and those briefings are for purposes of protecting campaigns and to allow transitions to occur.
And it was an unusual circumstance.
And
a participant in that briefing on the part of the Trump campaign was the subject of an FBI investigation.
That is correct, but it raises not significant policy questions.
But we should not draw the conclusion that there's no way the FBI should ever be given access to evidence that arises in the context of an intelligence briefing related to counterintelligence.
And that'll be up to Director Wray as we, in responding to our recommendation, to sort through that policy
question. Time has expired, and thank you.
Thank you. Senator Cruz, if I had just 30 seconds here. In the January meeting with the primary subsource, the Russian guy who provided Steele with all the information, wasn't there a Department of Justice official present at that meeting?
Yes, let me clarify on that. The people present were the primary subsource, his lawyer, 2 FBI Crossfire Hurricane people, and for parts of the interview, lawyers from the National Security Division. They were there not knowing the background necessarily. They were there because the primary subsource had a lawyer.
Okay.
And so the FBI wanted a lawyer there in case there were lawyer issues.
So we're beating up on the FBI, I think appropriately so to some point, but the Department of Justice, they were in the room too.
They were in the room, but the reason we note this here is there's a number of instances here where people get drive-bys.
No, I got you.
Right, and in government, you get a drive-by and someone tries to tag you with something that's not fair. That was our concern.
Fair enough. Senator Cruz.
Mr. Chairman, can I just close one point from page 341? The FBI's Mr. Baker told the IG and is quoted in his report as saying that the agent in that investigative briefing, quote, was not there to induce anybody to say anything. He was not there to do an undercover operation or elicit some type of statement or testimony.
Thank you.
Make sure that's in the
Very
record.
good.
Thank you.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, thank you for being here. And I want to start by taking the opportunity to thank not only you, but the men and women of your team that are gathered here. I think the work that you've done in the Inspector General's office is incredibly important. Reading this report, this is a 434-page report that lays out what I consider to be a stunning indictment of the FBI and the Department of Justice, of a pattern of abuse of power. And I will say both the Department of Justice and FBI for decades have had a great many honorable, principled professionals with a fidelity to rule of law. And this indictment, I'm an alumnus of the Department of Justice. This pattern of facts makes me angry, and it makes anyone who expects law enforcement to be nonpartisan and faithful to the law, it should make them angry as well. Now, the press has focused on your specific conclusion that you did not find evidence of political bias. That's a judgment you have. I disagree with that judgment. But I think that judgment is in many ways the least significant component of this report. I think the facts that are in this report
need to be understood, and they should be deeply chilling to anyone who understands the facts in this report, and then people can draw the inference as to why that pattern of abuse occurred.
Do you agree with that?
I'm sorry.
Do you agree with what he just said?
I think everybody can, the purpose of this report is to lay out the facts for the public, and everybody can debate and decide what they think of this information. I absolutely agree.
So this 434-page report outlines 17 major errors and misstatements that were made by the FBI or DOJ in securing FISA warrants. A number of them are deeply, deeply troubling. These are not typos. These are not small, inadvertent errors. These are grotesque abuse of power. Let's focus on a couple of them. The primary subsource. Primary subsource, and indeed the first error you note in the second, third, and fourth application for the FISA warrant is that the primary subsource reporting raised serious questions about the accuracy of the Steele dossier, which we now know was a bunch of malarkey, to use a term that's been in the news lately, and that the FISA court was not informed of that. Now let's get specifically, so the basis of this Steele report was what's referred to in your report as the primary subsource. That was the principal basis. And the FBI interviewed that primary subsource not once, not twice, but 3 times in January, March, and May of 2017. So that's the basis of this dossier. What did the primary subsource say? As the OIG report says, the interviews with the primary subsource raised, quote, significant questions about the reliability of the Steele reporting. What did the subsource say specifically? As your report goes on to say, it says Steele misstated or exaggerated multiple sections of the reporting. It says that portions of it, particularly the more salacious and sexual portions, were based on, quote, rumor and speculation. It says that some of the basis of that came from conversations with, quote, friends over beers and statements that were made in, quote, jest. And the primary subsource also says to take the other subsources, quote, with a grain of salt. Now, the FBI had that information, knew that the basis of this dossier was saying it's unreliable. And what did the FBI and DOJ do? In renewal application number 2 and number 3, the FBI advised the court, quote, the FBI found the Russian-based subsource to be truthful and cooperative with 0 revisions. You note that as the most significant misstatement, and that is going in front of a court of law, relying on facts that you know are unreliable without any basis. That was the number one. Yep. The number 2 major error in the applications was omitting Carter Page's prior relationship. Now, we now have evidence that Carter Page functioned as a source for a United States intelligence agency. That's a pretty darn important fact. If you're telling the FISA court, hey, the fact that this guy Carter Page, who I don't know this guy Carter Page, but the fact that he's talking to Russians, really suspicious, well, the fact that he's serving as a source for U.S. intelligence agents is pretty darn relevant to why he's talking to Russians, because we have lots of sources that are talking to bad guys. And when you don't tell the court that, you're deceiving the court. But it's worse than just deceiving the court. Because, as the OIG report details, an assistant general counsel in the FBI altered an email, fabricated evidence, and reading from the OIG report, specifically the words, and not a source, had been inserted into the email. That email then was sent on to the officials responsible for making the decision to go forward. And as the report said, let me read on page 256 of the OIG report, the final paragraph. Consistent with the Inspector General Act of 1978 and following OIG's discovery that the OGC attorney had altered the email that he sent to the supervising agent, who thereafter relied on it to swear out the final FISA application. So the men and women at home need to know what's happening. A lawyer at the FBI creates fraudulent evidence, alters an email. That is in turn used as the basis for a sworn statement to the court that the court relies on. Am I stating that accurately?
That's correct. That is what occurred.
Now, you have worked in law enforcement a long time. Is the pattern of a Department of Justice employee altering evidence and submitting fraudulent evidence that ultimately gets submitted to a court, is that commonplace? Is that typical?
I have not seen an alteration of an email end up impacting a court document like this.
In any ordinary circumstance, if a private citizen did this, fabricated evidence, and by the way, what he inserted was not just slightly wrong, it was 180 degrees opposite what the evidence said. So the intelligence agency said this guy is a source, and he inserted this guy is not a source. If a private citizen did that in any law enforcement investigation, if they fabricated evidence and reversed what it said, in your experience, would that private citizen be prosecuted for fabricating evidence, be prosecuted for obstruction of justice, be prosecuted for perjury?
They certainly would be considered for that if there was an intentional effort to deceive the court. On this one, I'm going to defer because, as we noted here in the sentence you indicated, we referred that over to the Attorney General and the FBI Director for handling.
Third major omission that the Department of Justice and the FBI did not tell the court is that this entire operation was funded by the DNC, was funded by the Hillary Clinton campaign and by Democrats. It was an Oppo research dump. Look, at some level, this is the most effective Oppo research dump in history because the Department of Justice and FBI were perfectly happy to be hatchet men for this Oppo research dump. Now, throughout every one of the filings, DOJ and the FBI didn't inform the FISA court that this was being paid for by the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign. Is that right?
That's not in any of the FISA applications.
So they didn't tell the court that. And it's not like DOJ didn't know. Indeed, one of the senior Department of Justice officials, Bruce Orr, his wife worked at Fusion GPS, the Oppo research company being paid by the DNC. And he became the principal liaison with Steele without telling anyone at the Department of Justice that he was essentially working on behalf of the Clinton campaign. Who at the Department of Justice was, and by the way, several Democrats, it's interesting seeing Democratic senators wanting to defend this abuse of power. Several senators, Senator Feinstein said, I wrote this down, the FBI didn't place spies in the Trump campaign. Senator Leahy said something similar. Well, that may be true, not spies in the Trump campaign, but reading from your report, in particular page 4 of the executive summary, your report says, thereafter, the Crossfire Hurricane team used the intrusive techniques, including confidential human sources, to interact and consensually record multiple conversations with Page and Papadopoulos, both before and after they were working for the Trump campaign, as well as on one occasion with a high-level Trump campaign official who was not the subject of the investigation. So they didn't place spies in the campaign, but they sent spies to record senior members of the campaign in the middle of a presidential campaign when that candidate was the nominee for the other major party that was the opposing party to the one in power. Is that right?
They send confidential human sources in to do those.
Did anyone at DOJ, who at DOJ knew about this? Did the Attorney General know about this? Did the White House know about this?
Based on what we found, nobody had been told in advance.
But once
Nobody
it was happening, did they know?
They did not. The only evidence that somebody knew were the line attorneys in NSD, in the National Security Division, when they were told very selective portions of what had occurred. Nobody knew beforehand. Nobody had been briefed. And frankly, that was one of the most concerning things here, is that nobody needed to be told.
And I can tell you from my time at the Department of Justice and from my time in law enforcement, any responsible leader, when hearing that you're talking about sending in spies and sending in a wiretap on any presidential nominee, should say, what in the hell are we doing? And by the way, the people up the chain who are saying we didn't know, if you had responsible leadership, there's no more important decision than you make. I can tell you when I was at DOJ, if someone said, let's tap Hillary Clinton, or let's tap Bill Clinton or John Kerry, the people there would have said, what in the hell are you talking about? What was going on here? This wasn't Jason Bourne. This was Beavis and Butthead.
Senator Klobuchar.
All right. I want to tone things down a little bit here. And first want to express my gratitude for the thousands of men and women who work every day on the front line with the FBI. I come from a background as a prosecutor, and our local law enforcement work with the FBI every day in our local office in Minnesota. And then in the Senate, I've had the privilege to work with many, many people in the FBI. And I think the Inspector General's job is incredibly important. He keeps everyone honest. But I do think it's important for those agents and for those in law enforcement that are watching today that people understand there are people up here that understand that you're simply doing your jobs, which I think is basically, with some suggestions and recommendations for change, what the Inspector General found in this report. So before I start my questions, I think it's important to put this discussion in context with what happened in the 2016 election, which is why we are here today. It is now undisputed by our intelligence agencies that Russia invaded our democracy, not with bombs or jets or tanks, but with a sophisticated cyber mission to undermine the underpinnings of our very democracy, a democracy that hundreds of thousands of men and women have lost their lives on the battlefield defending both our democracy and democracies abroad, a democracy that 4 little girls' innocents at the height of the civil rights movement lost their lives in a church in Birmingham, Alabama, because people were trying to hold on to that democracy and make sure that it was extended to people in this country. So let's remember why we're here today. Let's remember the words of Dan Coates, the former director of the National Intelligence Agency, who served in the Senate, well respected by colleagues on both sides of the aisle. He said that, in fact, Russia has been emboldened to do this again. And I did appreciate Senator Graham's words that he made clear that it was not Ukraine that invaded this election. It was Russia. And it was the words of Fiona Hill and the impeachment hearings over in the House that I thought were important to remember. She said anyone that is repeating this lie is basically peddling in Russian propaganda. So let's remember that this is not about one election or one party. It is about our democracy. What can we do? Well, we can be honest, and we can stop making political hay out of this, and we can actually take some actions that would protect our election in 2020. And that includes finishing the work that Senator Langford and I have started to pass not only the money, which I appreciate, to help states to secure our elections, but to also get in place requirements to push those states that don't have backup paper ballots fully, 11 of them, to get those backup paper ballots, and to make sure we have audits and to make sure we have better communication between federal and state authorities, to do something about the propaganda by actually moving forward on the bill that Senator McCain and I had and that Senator Graham and I now have, the Honest Ads Act, which requires those social media companies, and I have absolutely no idea why we don't do that, to play by the same rules of the road for paid political ads, which would greatly help us, but not completely, but greatly help us with this propaganda problem. So here we go. You wrote this report, Inspector Horowitz, after interviewing more than 100 witnesses and reviewing over 1 million documents. Is that right?
That's correct.
And under department guidelines, an investigation has an authorized purpose if it is open to detect, obtain information about, or prevent or protect against federal crimes or threats to the national security, or to collect foreign intelligence. You found that the investigation at issue today was open to determine whether people associated with the Trump campaign were coordinating with the Russian government. Is that right?
That is the reason the FBI provided.
And again, to be clear, you did not find that the FBI acted improperly when it opened the counterintelligence investigation that you reviewed in writing in this report.
That's
Is that
correct.
right? The department's guidelines also require that a decision to open investigation is supported by, as you describe in your report, allegations, reports, facts, or circumstances that indicate the possibility of criminal activity or a national security threat. You found that the FBI's investigation was predicated on a report from a friendly foreign government that heard that the Trump campaign had received some kind of suggestion that Russia could help them by releasing information that was damaging to Hillary Clinton. Is that right?
That's correct.
As a former prosecutor, I know that it is critical that the FBI is able to take an action like it did here to investigate threats to our national security. Do you think that interference in our elections by a foreign government constitutes a national security threat?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Does anything in your report call into question the finding in the special counsel's report that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in a sweeping and systematic fashion?
No, it doesn't. In fact, we cite the special counsel's report here in a footnote laying out all the different reports that have been released on that issue.
Does anything in your report call into question Chairman Burr's statement, the Republican Chairman Burr's statement, that, quote, Russia is waging an information warfare campaign against the U.S. that didn't start and didn't end with the 2016 election?
No, it doesn't.
Does anything in your report call into question the assessment by FBI Director Wray that Russians' interference in our elections is ongoing and that its interference in the 2018 midterms were a, quote, dress rehearsal, end quote, for the 2020 elections?
No, it doesn't.
Does anything in your report call into question the finding in the special counsel's report that, quote, the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and work to secure that outcome?
We don't take issue with any part of the special counsel's report, no.
Okay. Did you find any evidence that political bias or other improper consideration affected the FBI's decision to open the investigation into George Papadopoulos?
No, we don't.
Did you find any evidence that political bias or other improper considerations affected the decision to open the investigation into Paul Manafort?
No, we don't.
Did you find any evidence that political bias or other improper considerations affected the decision to open the investigation into Michael Flynn?
We did not.
Did you find any investigation that political bias or other improper considerations affected the decision to open the investigation into Carter Page?
No documentary or testimonial evidence or other evidence.
So we are clear, did your report uncover systematic political bias at the FBI?
As to what we looked at and the openings, we did not find documentary testimonial evidence to support a finding of bias.
Can you comment on why it is critical that the American people have confidence in the rule of law and the independence of the Justice Department?
Absolutely. I also was a former prosecutor and federal prosecutor previously. I did public corruption cases in the Southern District of New York. And the whole foundation of the Justice Department and law enforcement on the federal level and at the state and local level is apolitical, non-political decision-making made by prosecutors and agents working together to protect communities.
Very good. I want to follow up on your discussion on the issue you briefly discussed, whistleblowers, with Senator Feinstein, because it's so important, and I know that Senator Grassley also cares a lot about this issue. Can you speak generally to how often in your career information provided to whistleblowers has proved important and led to uncover wrongdoing?
Well, I'll speak to certainly my experience in the 7 years as IG, as in the first instance. From the get-go, fast and furious, critical that the agents came forward there. We've found numerous instances in our audits and our reviews with whistleblowers coming forward and reporting evidence. And I'll add going back 30 years to my career as a prosecutor in New York doing police corruption cases. We had an incredibly brave and courageous police officer who saw corruption in his midst and came forward and reported it and allowed us to make a very substantial police corruption case that would have continued but for that courageous officer.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. After your report was released on Monday, Attorney General Barr stated his opinion that the FBI launched an intrusive investigation of a U.S. presidential campaign on the thinnest of suspicions. When the FBI decided to open its investigations, the U.S. Intelligence Committee was already aware of Russian efforts to interfere with the 2016 election. Is that correct?
I'm actually not sure what the Intelligence Committee knew at the time.
It was in that context that the FBI received information. I'm just going to let's move forward, understand your answer. That the FBI received information from a foreign government, which we know from reports came from an Australian diplomat, that reported that a Trump campaign official suggested that the Trump campaign had received some kind of suggestion from Russia that would assist the campaign by releasing information that would be damaging to Hillary Clinton's campaign. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Your report also quoted then Chief of the National Security Division, David Loffman, who said that it would have been a, quote, dereliction of duty and responsibility of the highest order not to commit the appropriate resources as urgently as possible to run these facts to the ground and find out what's going on. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In light of all of that was occurring at that time, and it's always easy in hindsight to look back at things, but at that time, do you agree with Attorney General Barr that the investigation was predicated on the thinnest of suspicions?
Well, I'm not going to get into a comparison on what his view. He's free to have his opinion. We have our finding, and as I said earlier, I stand by our conclusion.
And your conclusion, again, is?
That it was sufficient predication to open the investigation based on the low threshold required by department and FBI policy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about Page, just briefly about Papadopoulos.
Yes.
I don't want anybody to believe that anybody named in the initial investigation has been convicted of being an agent of the Russians. Has anybody associated with the Trump campaign been charged with the crime of colluding with the Russians?
Not that I know of as I sit here.
No, I think we would know by now. Mr. Papadopoulos, he was actually being surveilled by the FBI, is that correct?
If you're talking about the confidential human source operations, yes. They did CHS operations with him. They considered but did not proceed to seek a FISA application.
Okay, well, but he was being wiretapped and he didn't know it.
Well, he was being an undercover operation and having a wire with a.
He's talking to somebody that's got a wire.
Source. Right. I just want to be careful because you do a wire, you think of a court order.
No, trust me.
I just want to be careful how I say that.
With a court order.
Right.
So this was done because they can do it.
Correct.
They can do it. They don't have to get anybody's permission.
Well, they need the supervisory approval within the Bureau. That's it.
331, I just want you to know what Papadopoulos said when he didn't know he was being wiretapped. No, we don't want to work with the Russians, basically. I'm summarizing here. That'd be treason. Senator Sass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, thank you for being here, and to all of your team. You've done important work, so thank you to all of you in the rows 1 and 2 as well. There are a number of things that are really troubling, but some of them have been unpacked pretty fully so far, so I'm going to pick up some loose ends. Bruce Orr. Who is he, and what's his role at the department? And then let's ask some questions about the bizarre pathway by which he became involved in this investigation.
So at the time of these events, he was an associate deputy attorney general and the head of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, working out of the deputy attorney general's office.
The Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Force, and that's connected to election interference by the Russians. How?
It is not.
What the hell's he doing here?
That was precisely the concern, that we lay out here. He had no role in any of the election interference matters.
We have a bunch of people in the media who wanted to read this as a Rorschach test, and they wanted to have a predetermined answer for exactly how to interpret each piece of this. And so as the chairman began today, he said, predicate of investigation appropriate, but some minor mistakes and errors were made. You've outlined in this 478 or 434, depending on whether we count all the Roman numerals, page report, 17 significant errors in this investigation.
Bruce Orr, who has a very significant senior role, ODAG, for those who don't know, the Office of the Deputy Attorney General, has primary oversight of all law enforcement agencies in America. So if you're in the FBI and you might make a mistake in your investigation, the people you'd be in trouble with normally are in the Deputy Attorney General's office. And here's a guy in the Deputy Attorney General's office who ultimately gets involved, inserts himself into this investigation. And I think it's pretty important to recognize we've got a massive cultural systemic failure. If a guy from ODAG, who should be doing oversight of this case, if he weren't off on another assignment about organized crime and drug trafficking, if he were going to get involved in this, he should be checking the work of the people who were doing the work. And there are a whole bunch of department protocols and provisions that were violated throughout this. But Bruce Orr, he ultimately decides to get extra information out of Christopher Steele after Christopher Steele or his employer, Fusion GPS, had been cut off by the FBI. Why did the FBI decide to no longer listen to Christopher Steele?
So he was closed in November of 2016 after the FBI learned of his disclosure to Mother Jones magazine that he had been working with the FBI previously.
And we know from the evidence that Senator Cruz went through, there were a whole bunch of subsources that Christopher Steele was summarizing, and the FBI at that point was believing he might be a credible guy. And they ultimately realized that this is a bunch of BS, and his subsources are saying, I said some of this in jest, and some of it's stuff that I overheard in a bar. None of it is information that I had firsthand knowledge of. And so the FBI decides, reasonably, that Mr. Steele's information isn't credible, right? So they cut him off.
Actually, let me just be clear. That isn't what caused them to cut him off. What caused them to cut him off is they learned he had talked to the press in Mother Jones magazine. They actually had that other information and didn't tell anybody about it.
Okay, so
so
you're disagreeing with me only to say the problems with Mr. Steele are twice as bad as I summarized.
I'm just saying that isn't why they cut him off.
Okay.
Right? That's the concern, is that
so then Bruce Orr, who doesn't have any responsibilities in this area, decides he'll insert himself into the investigation and go get additional information from or about Christopher Steele and the people who are funding Christopher Steele. Can you just remind us, who's Bruce Orr married to?
Bruce Orr's spouse, Nellie Orr, had formerly been, at the time he started interacting in November 2016 with Steele, had been a former independent contractor for Fusion GPS.
So in other words, Bruce Orr decides to insert himself into an investigation after the professional agents involved in this investigation said Mr. Steele isn't reputable, isn't credible, and has been talking to the media. So we're now not going to talk to Christopher Steele anymore. Bruce Orr says, actually, I should. And he meets with these people who are funding or who are the employers of Christopher Steele or own his dossier, who's also Bruce Orr's wife's source of compensation.
Had been. As of, I think, September 2016, she had no longer been an independent contractor. And I want to also, I think it's important to be clear, because this is relevant, again, to the significance of some of the inappropriate actions here. The FBI was not a reluctant participant in this relationship that was the conduit from Bruce Orr, through Bruce Orr to Steele, as we lay out here. So I just want to be clear. They're not saying we don't want to deal with him. They're saying, oh, yeah, essentially, if you have something, we would love to hear from you.
I want to just say that I wish Mike Lee weren't sitting here 2 people away from me right now, because as a national security hawk, I have argued with Mike Lee in the 4.5 or 5 years that I've been in the Senate that stuff just like this couldn't possibly happen at the FBI and at the Department of Justice. So as somebody who is embarrassed on behalf of the FBI about your report, because I believe that it is critically important that we have the FISA statute. I think the FISC is an incredibly important court. The approval rating of applications that come before the FISC are off the charts. I don't know the current numbers, but a couple years ago when I saw them, I think it was 97.9%. Is that a fair?
I think the last number I saw was roughly 98%.
Okay, so a 98% approval rating of applications that come before the FISC. Why would it be that high? People would normally say, and I'm not asking you to answer that. I'm saying that the good answer is, in an ex parte, I'm not an attorney, but in an ex parte proceeding before the court, when you, the American citizen who might be being surveilled or be suspected of something that would open a surveillance warrant against you, the assumption would be, if you can't be there to defend yourself, it's because the department's lawyers are so super scrupulous that if there's any information that might exonerate you or that might counteract the view that led them to first pursue a theory of the case that had them wanting to surveil you, they would say the bar is so high here, we'll always err on the side of privacy unless we believe there's a good reason to pursue this investigation. And so Mike Lee has warned me for 4.5 years, the potential for abuse in this space is terrible, and I constantly defended the integrity and the professionalism of the Bureau and of the department that you couldn't have something like this happen. Let's move on from Bruce Orr and move to the renewals. The renewals, the first one we can have a debate about. That's been the headline about whether or not there was political bias that led to the opening of the investigation. The second, the third, and the fourth warrant against, or FISA proceeding against Carter Page are based on an assumption the court has that, hey, we got a bunch of information the first time we heard this case, and if we thought it was legitimate to open a case into this guy, the Bureau is going to have so much integrity and the department's lawyers are going to have so much integrity. If there's ever a reason for them to doubt information that led to the opening application they made to us, they'll bring us that information. So in renewals 2, 3, and 4, they bring none of this information, right?
That's correct. They're not telling the department, so the lawyers at the department can decide what to include for the court.
So I think we face a massive crisis of public trust in American life in general, partly because an open society is going to be susceptible to the kinds of influence operations that Russia runs against us on a daily basis in a clunky way, but that China is eventually going to run against us in a very sophisticated way. The real debate we should be having on TV and in the print journalist community about moments like this is not fundamentally about making this month 48 or month 49 of the 2016 presidential election that will never die. We should be having an advanced conversation about 2024, 2028, and 2032 when China with deep fakes runs influence operations against us that are going to be far more sophisticated and far more dangerous than this. And so if the Bureau functions this poorly during a moment like this, when we actually have a really sophisticated attack against the U.S., we're going to have a much, much bigger problem if the American people don't think they can trust this. And so whether or not people are going to agree with your opening headline on whether or not political bias was a relevant factor in the opening in the investigation, there is no doubt that there's a massive cultural failing inside DOJ and at the FBI that would allow renewals to come in the second, third, and the fourth case without anybody ever thinking that their work is going to be scrutinized again. If this is what happens, and this is arguably the second, third, or fourth most important investigation in the history of the FBI, if this can happen in an investigation where they would expect there's going to be a lot of subsequent scrutiny, what is your suspicion about what happens in a regular FISA application or renewal process? If the American people hear this and they say this can happen against a campaign for the presidency of the United States, what happens in an ordinary FISA case?
That was exactly our concern and why we started this week a new review and audit to look at others, not only on the intel side, counterintelligence side, but on the counterterrorism side and on U.S. persons. What else is going on there? We want to be fair. We don't want to do it just on this, but for the reasons you indicated, if it's happening here, what's going on elsewhere?
I want to summarize something that you say on page 14, which is to this point, because so many people are just reading this hearing or listening to this hearing through the lenses of who their favorite red or blue jersey team was in the 2016 election. But you're saying something really fundamental about a culture that Director Wray needs to rebuild. Quote, there are so many basic and fundamental errors, were made by 3 separate hand-picked teams on one of the most sensitive FBI investigations that was briefed to the highest levels within the FBI, and that the FBI officials expected would eventually be subjected to close scrutiny, raised significant questions regarding the FBI chain of command's management and supervision of the FISA process. Jumping ahead, in our view, this was a failure of not only the operational team, but also of the managers and the supervisors, including the senior officials in the chain of command. For these reasons, we recommend that the FBI review of the performance of these employees and who had the responsibility for the preparation, the Woods review, which is essentially where you check your work and you say, do we have any footnotes and could we corroborate this if we had to, if asked by the FISA court or other supervisors, or, picking up your quote again, approval of the FISA applications as well as the managers and supervisors in the chain of command of the Carter Page investigation, including senior officials, and take appropriate action, action deemed appropriate. This means potential discipline and firing, I assume. In addition, given the extensive compliance failures we identified in this review, we believe that additional OIG oversight work is required to assess the FBI's compliance with the department and FBI FISA-related policies that seek to protect the civil liberties of the U.S. persons. also known as the whole Fourth Amendment. Accordingly, we have today initiated, this is a big headline, folks, and accordingly, today we have initiated an OIG audit that will further examine the FBI's compliance with the Woods procedures in FISA applications that target U.S. persons in both counterintelligence and counterterrorism investigations. That's a big headline. You're saying there is a systematic cultural failure of accountability at the Bureau related to the FISA process. Mike Lee doesn't drink, but I'd buy him whiskey right now if he did, because there are a whole bunch of things we've argued about for a long time, and he's right about things that I think ought not be right. And if we had another 10-minute round, Lindsay's round was 94 minutes, so I'm going to go over by at least 25 seconds. If we had time for another round, I think we should ask some really fundamental questions about the defensive briefing as well. In the American system, when the people get to pick politicians to represent them, for a time, the politicians aren't better people than the bureaucrats, but they're the ones who hold certificates of election. When the people are elected, those politicians incoming don't know as much as the bureaucrats at the top levels of the agencies, because the agency experts have been there for a long time. That's what the defensive briefing should be about, not an investigatory Trojan horse.
Thank you. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Inspector General Horowitz, I'm impressed by the thoroughness of your team's work. You reviewed 1 million documents and conducted interviews of more than 100 witnesses, including several on multiple occasions. I think it was 170 interviews. Would you agree with me broadly that this is a testament to the rule of law and the transparency of our system, that your office can produce such a searching and thorough report that contains some criticism of the most powerful federal law enforcement agency in our nation?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more, and it's a testament to the Congress for creating the Inspector General community.
This is why we have your office and Inspector General, to provide an independent assessment of the facts that's not beholden to any particular partisan agenda. FBI Director Chris Wray said in his response to your report that the FBI, and I quote, accepts the report's findings and embraces the need for thoughtful, meaningful remedial action. Let me just begin by expressing my appreciation to you and to Director Wray for being guided by the facts rather than some of the more breathless conspiracy theories that have been spread recently. President Trump has called the entire Russia investigation a witch hunt and a hoax. But your report found that the FBI had an authorized purpose when it opened its investigation into whether individuals associated with that campaign were coordinating with the Russian government's broad efforts to interfere in our 2016 presidential election, which was grounded in protecting our national security. Do you stand by that conclusion?
And we stand by our conclusion.
So let's talk about what we all know was happening in 2016 when this investigation began. Russian intelligence hacked the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton campaign. Does your report disprove that finding of the Russia investigation?
No, we don't disprove any of the findings in the Russian
We also know Russian intelligence was strategically acting to release stolen emails through WikiLeaks, through DC Leaks, with an intention to try and help Donald Trump's presidential campaign, and you don't disagree with that?
We don't disagree with it, and we don't address it.
The Russian Internet Research Agency conducted a coordinated influence campaign on social media to try and tear apart American society, to sow discord, and your report doesn't disagree with that conclusion.
Correct.
So let me just, in summary, when the FBI opened this investigation known as Crossfire Hurricane, Russia was at that time engaging in an unprecedented and broad-scale attack on our election and our democracy. Then candidate Trump's response wasn't to denounce Russia's actions. It was to say, and I quote, as a candidate, Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find Hillary's emails. It was to praise WikiLeaks for leaking stolen emails. It was even to suggest that Russia was not responsible. It might be someone weighing 400 pounds sitting on their bed in their mother's home. So all this was happening while the FBI was trying to protect our elections and our democracy. I would have preferred to see our president criticize then the Russians who were attacking our elections. But to your report, if I might, Bill Priestap, who was Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division, approved the opening of the FBI investigation into possible connections between the Trump campaign and Russian interference. He told your office there was a counterintelligence concern that the FBI was obligated to investigate. Did you find any evidence at all to suggest Mr. Priestap's actions were motivated by bias, by his political views, by partisanship, rather than his sense of obligation to protect the country?
We did not.
On March 4th, 2017, President Trump tweeted, "Terrible. Just found out Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower before my victory. Nothing found. This is McCarthyism." Did your investigation identify any evidence President Obama ordered the FBI to tap Donald Trump's phone?
We didn't find any evidence the FBI had tapped any other phones or anything else other than the FISA that we addressed.
But you did find that an FBI employee doctored an email in order to support the Carter Page FISA application, correct?
Correct.
Well, as your report concludes, and as many have said, I'm here to restate that that's inexcusable, and we must hold federal law enforcement to the highest standards, even those of us who support federal law enforcement. Let me ask a question about the response of the agency. Who appointed FBI Director Chris Wray?
President Trump.
And did Director Wray accept all of the findings of your investigation?
He did.
And that includes your finding that the investigation and related investigations were opened for an authorized purpose with adequate predication. Did he agree with that?
That's correct.
Okay. Your report identified errors the FBI made in conjunction with the Page FISA applications. We shouldn't minimize those errors, but I think it's critical to put them in context. Your report doesn't speculate as to whether a FISA warrant would have been authorized for Mr. Page if officials had considered all the relevant information in a timely way. Is that correct?
That's correct. We don't speculate on what the
And
outcome
Mr.
would have
Page
been.
wasn't indicted in the Russia investigation.
He was not charged as far as I understand.
But the president's campaign manager, deputy campaign manager, national security advisor, foreign policy advisor, personal attorney, and longtime strategist were all either convicted of crimes or pled guilty in federal courts. Is that correct?
I think I followed the list, but
Roughly.
I understand what you're saying. I won't disagree with you.
Did you identify FISA errors with regards to any other Trump campaign official who'd been under investigation?
The only FISA we found existed was the one we've written about here as to Carter Page.
So within the broader context of the Trump campaign and the investigation and the outcome, I just thought it was worth repeating that the Mueller investigation produced 37 indictments, guilty pleas, and convictions, and none of those are called into question by your report. Is that correct?
We don't address those at all.
So one point with some bipartisan agreement today, one of the only points I've heard with bipartisan agreement today, is a renewed interest in reforming the FISA process. And while we continue to consider as the Senate reauthorizing sections of the Patriot Act, I'd welcome suggestions from FBI Director Wray as to statutory reforms to ensure the errors we saw here in the Page process don't happen again, while ensuring the FBI has the authorities it needs to protect our nation. I'm encouraged Director Wray fully accepts your specific recommendations, but I think Congress should also consider reforms to safeguard civil liberties. In this regard, I'm more in Senator Lee's camp than Senator Sass's. I.G. Horowitz, do you believe some of the problems your report uncovered would benefit from congressional action to reform the FISA process?
We haven't talked about that, but that's a very important point, Senator. As you know, we make recommendations to the department. We don't make recommendations to Congress. Congress, though, has, I think, important issues to think about in this report as to how this process can be improved and ensure that these kind of errors are addressed going forward.
Well, Inspector General, I am grateful for your service and for your work. Let me just conclude with one last question. President Trump has repeatedly claimed that FBI agents and officials were biased against him and worked to favor the campaign of his opponent, Hillary Clinton. In your investigation, did you find that the FBI took any investigative step based on political bias against now President Trump?
I'm going to be careful on that because of the referral we made per the IG Act on the altered email and some of the other issues we found on the FISA.
But did you find any substantive investigative step that was influenced by political bias?
Again, I'm going to be careful because we have a situation where we have the altered email by the individual who, as we know in the footnotes, had text messages that were concerning that were identified last year. So I'm going to defer on what the rationale might have been.
What that one-step rationale might have been. But overarching, your conclusion was that the initiation of this investigation was well predicated and was for a lawful purpose.
Correct. In terms of the opening, going back to the opening, correct.
Thank you very much, Mr. Inspector General, for your report.
But as to everything that followed the opening, there's a lot of concern.
I have a lot of concerns about the FISA process and how that occurred. Not, to be clear, the confidential informant issue raises significant policy questions, but we found they complied with the policies there.
Peter Strzok worked for who?
Over time he moved up the chain. So, but at some of the key times here, Mr. Priestap.
Okay. Senator Hawley.
Let me just start where Senator Coons left off. So you have said that you had significant concerns about the authorization or the application for the FISA warrants, right? You said earlier when it came to political bias, when you move to the FISA warrants, things get murkier. I believe that was the word you used. Is that correct?
Correct.
Because, you can open an investigation. I say this as a former law enforcement official myself. You can open an investigation pretty easily. You've testified today that it can be done quite easily. But when you actually start taking action, start taking steps, start gathering evidence, start surveilling Americans, that's when actually real questions arise. And your testimony today has been, and in this report, is that when that happened, there's potential concerns here about political bias. Is that correct?
We have actions taken here that were not consistent with the rules, the practices, the policies, and what we couldn't reach a conclusion on is what motivated that.
Yeah, I think that's very significant. I mean, let me just be honest with you. Here's the question that I'm struggling with. Which is worse? Is it worse to have a foreign government trying to meddle in our elections? Or is it worse to have our own government meddling in the election? Because that's, I think, exactly what this report shows. It shows that our government, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the nation, the FBI, effectively meddled in an ongoing presidential campaign. And the thing that gets me is you expect it from foreign governments. I'm not saying it's good, but I'm saying that you expect it. They've been doing it for years. Russia's been doing it for years. We know they tried to do it this last cycle. China has been doing it. Others have been doing it. And we know what steps to take. We've got to take them more effectively. But when our own government does it, how can the American people have confidence? And what do we do? I mean, what do we do? And there's one actor here, I think, who has not gotten the credit that they collectively deserve, and that's the Democrat National Committee. I just think, I've heard my friends on the other side of the aisle complain about Hillary Clinton's campaign and how ineffective it was and how the DNC didn't do a good job in 2016. I beg to differ. This is the most incredible. The DNC pays for the Steele dossier, solicits the Steele dossier, and then gets the Federal Bureau of Investigation to go get FISA warrants, surveil an American citizen, surveil a presidential campaign, all on the basis of this manufactured garbage that they paid for. I mean, that's extraordinary. That has got to be a first time in history. In fact, let me just ask you, Mr. Horowitz, are you aware ever of another presidential campaign being targeted by the FBI during the campaign like the Trump one was, to your knowledge? Has this ever happened?
To my knowledge, but I wouldn't suggest I'm an expert on.
But to your knowledge, no. You're not aware of anything like this. So, and I'm correct in thinking that the Steele dossier, the Fusion GPS dossier, was solicited by and paid for the DNC. I mean, that's correct based on what
or the Clinton campaign or the DNC, it was ultimately learned by the FBI that was the case, or that came to be their belief.
And then, so we get the Steele dossier. It's fed to the FBI. The FBI goes and asks for these FISA warrants, which have all of the problems that you have articulated and that my colleagues have drawn out, including sometimes outright fabrication of evidence in these FISA applications. And then, not only does the FBI get a surveillance program ongoing effectively of a presidential campaign during cycle, but they also get, the DNC also gets, news stories written during the campaign about the surveillance program. In September of 2016, there's a story about possible counterintelligence investigation of the Trump campaign. In October of 2016, there's a story about the FBI investigating the Trump campaign, and we know on that last one that that Steele himself was involved. Is that correct? In October.
That's correct, and the FBI actually ultimately knew that he was involved in the September one as well, that you're referencing, I believe.
And yet, what action did the FBI take when they knew these two facts?
Well, in November, they closed him, but then met with... What
did the Crossfire Hurricane teams take? What steps did they take when they knew this about Steele is what I should ask.
I'm sorry. Well, what happened is they closed him as a source in November, but that's when the meetings with Mr. Orr started, where he was the conduit between.
Right. So he's still able, the FBI still takes the information just via a DOJ conduit, which is its own separate, unbelievable problem. But yet still they're taking all this information on board from Steele, even after they know that he's totally incredible. To me, this is the untold story of the 2016 campaign. And I don't know who at the DNC hatched this, but I suppose they ought to, maybe it's take a victory lap, but certainly they should be remembered for it, to get the FBI to pursue surveillance of a rival presidential campaign and then into the newly elected president's term. I think is just extraordinary. It is absolutely extraordinary. So let me ask you this. Are these individuals whose misdeeds that you have documented here in this report, the members, I'm thinking of the case agents, other members on the Crossfire Hurricane team, are they still, to your knowledge, working at the FBI?
To my understanding, some are, some aren't.
And why are those who are, why are they still there? What's your understanding?
I think you'd have to ask Director Wray.
And indeed, I think we should. What about the case agent who directly misled the DOJ intelligence attorney, Office of Intelligence Attorney, about Carter Page's relationship with other intelligence agencies in our government, who directly misled the OI about that? Is that person, to your knowledge, still at the FBI?
To my knowledge, that person is still there.
And is still actively working, maybe is still acting as a case agent,
I think
to your knowledge?
Have to ask.
What about procedures at the FBI? To your knowledge, what procedures have been changed at the FBI to date to prevent something like this from happening?
I think all that I'm aware of is what's in Director Wray's letter that's attached here. But certainly there are far more reforms and changes that are needed to address all of our recommendations. That's a good beginning, but there's a lot more to be done.
I will just say in closing, Mr. Chairman, that I think it is an extraordinary thing when the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country, maybe the world, is able to effectively intervene and influence a presidential election at the behest and with the cooperation of another political party. I mean, I've been saying for a long time that, you know, there's no collusion in the 2016 campaign. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think the collusion was between the DNC and the FBI, and it is, if we don't change something here, I mean, to see FBI Director Wray go out and say in the face of all of this that he doesn't think that this vindicates the FBI and he doesn't think there are any problems, I, for one, don't know how any American can have confidence in that institution and in the integrity of our elections if things like this can happen. So thank you, Mr. Horowitz, for the work you've done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Horowitz. And again, thank you to you and your team for your work. Do you agree that the FBI meddled in the 2016 election?
What I found is what's in this report. I'm not going.
Did you find any evidence that the FBI purposefully intervened to affect the outcome of the 2016 election?
We've written about what they did here and in last year's report, and I'll stand on those findings and those findings alone.
I didn't find any conclusion that the FBI meddled or interfered in the election to affect the outcome.
We did not reach that conclusion.
You didn't reach a conclusion about the FBI intervening in the election or acting out of political bias, correct?
I would say I'm going to stick by this report and last year's mid-year election report on what it did, because there are specific findings as to specific individuals.
Let me ask you about some of those findings, but let me just say at the very outset, I know you're a career official, and I want to pay tribute to all of the law enforcement officials, particularly in the FBI, because I can see how some of what's been said about them might be severely and unfairly demoralizing. We have your back. We have your back. When you're out there enforcing the law with weapons pointed at you, and sometimes they are firearms and sometimes they are political weapons, we should have your back. So some of what's been said here, but also in the larger realm of public comment, I think has been severely a disservice to our law enforcement and to the United States, because we are discouraging able and dedicated young people from joining your ranks, and we need them. And I say that as a former United States attorney and a state attorney general who has worked with some of the best and some of the less best. So let me ask you a few questions about those findings. President Trump has said repeatedly that the FBI, quote, tried to overthrow the presidency. Did you find any evidence that the FBI tried to overthrow the presidency?
No, what we found is, again, laid out here in this report.
Well, is there any evidence that you found that the FBI tried to overthrow the presidency?
No, we found the issues
The
we
answer is
identified
no,
here. That's
correct?
what we found.
Did you find any evidence that the FBI tried to entrap anyone?
As a legal matter, since we don't see any actual cases come out of this, I think the answer is
There
no.
was no entrapment, correct?
Yeah,
Did you find any evidence that the FBI tapped the phones at Trump Tower?
no. The only wiretapping or the only surveillance we found was what's laid out here.
Did you find any evidence that the FBI planted informants in the Trump campaign?
No.
Did you find any evidence that the FBI tried specifically to entrap any of the individuals who were the focus of their investigation, namely Manafort, Flynn, Papadopoulos, or Page?
Entrapment's a legal term when you're moving forward on a criminal case. We didn't see that in this case.
Correct. There's no evidence here of entrapment. But the president has claimed that there was entrapment, that his phones were tapped, that Carter Page may have been used as a spy. Did you find evidence that the FBI put spies in the Trump campaign?
I'm going to speak to the terminology used at the department that we oversee, which is confidential human sources. And we did not find evidence that the FBI sought to place confidential human sources inside the campaign or plant them inside the campaign.
Would you agree with the contention that the Russia investigation, including the Mueller investigation, was a quote-unquote bogus narrative?
We don't address the Russia investigation or take issue with its handling at all in this report.
Well, in fact, you found or agreed with Mueller that the Russian government attacked our democracy in a sweeping and systematic way, correct?
We add a couple pages in here as background to reference not only the Mueller report, but other reports as well, including congressional reports on that issue.
Did you show this report to Attorney General Barr before it was released?
Yeah, as standard process, we provide this to the Attorney General and to the FBI Director.
Did he suggest any changes?
He didn't suggest any changes, and, you know, we
He
got
didn't
some...
suggest any corrections?
Well, he found a few typos and other things that he suggested we might want to think about.
So you must have been surprised by his attack on you and your team.
No, I had some idea he wasn't completely supportive of that.
Do you think he was fair?
He's the Attorney General of the United States. I've had cases where, situations where there have been disagreements between myself and leadership of the components, and...
Well, I want to give you a chance to defend yourself and your team, who have done a highly professional job here, 19 months, hundreds of witnesses, hard work. Do you think this attack on you and your team is fair?
I'll say this. My defense of our team and our work is we stand by the report. Nothing I've heard changes our view. The department, the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, the FBI Director, whomever, is free to disagree with my conclusions. I didn't take the IG job to be popular and to not have my feelings hurt. I wouldn't be the IG if that was the case.
I assume you would not agree with the characterization that the agents involved in this work on the investigation of the Russian attack on our democracy were quote-unquote scum, would you?
I would not call people names like that.
I welcome my colleagues' apparently newfound indignation about the potential reform of the FISA court and the process. And you well know, I'm sure, that reforms have been suggested. In fact, I authored the FISA Court Reform Act in 2013 with 18 co-sponsors, all Democrats. That legislation would have created a special advocate. It would have created other checks because the FISA process is secret, because Ordinarily, we don't want our adversaries to know we're investigating them, correct?
Right.
But there still needs to be checks and balances, scrutiny, to make sure that accurate information is presented to the FISA judges who work in secret. Unfortunately, a great many of those proposed reforms did not become law. Some did in the USA Freedom Act in 2015. I know it's not your job to make recommendations about FISA court reforms, but do you think that your report indicates the need for the kinds of reforms that I proposed in the FISA Court Reform Act of 2013?
I think that it's very important to have consideration of reforms like that. And we don't make the recommendations, but we are always available to help with legislation drafting or other support.
I hope that we can make use of your expertise in this area, and I hope my Republican colleagues who've been so vocal and vehement about the dangers of potential FISA abuses will join me in looking forward and reform of that court. Did you show this report to United States Attorney Durham?
In November, he received a copy of the report during our factual accuracy review process, according to our usual practice.
There have been public reports that there were references, at least one, to United States Attorney Durham in this report. Is that correct? In one of the early drafts?
I'm not going to get into what was in an earlier draft or comments. The whole reason we do this with the drafts is to allow for us to engage with individuals, the department, the FBI. We make changes when we get things wrong. We make changes if we think we need to clarify. So I'd rather not get into what our draft reports might or might not have said.
Did he make requests for changes?
He did. He told us what he disagreed with, and we considered his comments. And again, what you see here is our final report that we stand by. He disagreed on the predication question. I mentioned earlier the nature of our conversation.
Did you remove any reference to him at his request?
Again, I don't believe I can get into or should get into what our drafts did or didn't say. There are edits made through the review process, and there are many people who ask us to make edits. We don't make many, but I think if we start talking about what various people gave us comments on, it would be a challenge to do these reports, which is why, and partly, I was surprised by the press release.
Did you conclude in this report that your findings showed a grotesque abuse of power?
We did not say that in the report.
And would you agree with that characterization?
We did not reach a conclusion like that, so I wouldn't agree with that at this point. From my standpoint, people can have that viewpoint, but that wasn't our conclusion.
And just one last question. Those FISA warrants, they were renewed a number of times, correct?
3 times.
Based on your experience and maybe your report, there's a reason why warrants are renewed. They're renewed because they are producing useful information, correct?
Or they should be producing useful information.
They should be.
Is how I'll phrase it.
And your review of those warrants would indicate that they were producing useful information, correct?
Not sure that's entirely correct, and I don't know how much I can say about that in this setting.
Well, they were producing information.
They were producing information. I'm not sure how I would characterize whether they were helpful or not.
Well, one way or the other, far from being a bogus narrative, the Russia investigation produced 37 individual indictments, 7 convictions, 5 prison terms, and hopefully will send a message to adversaries, the Russians and other nations that Mr. Mueller warned about, that there will be action taken against them. And I hope that we can come together on a bipartisan basis to reform the FISA process, but just as importantly, forestall the ongoing attack on our democracy. I think that's maybe the most important point here, that your report in every possible way ought to alarm Americans about the ongoing attack on our nation by the Russians and other nations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Tillis, very quickly, I think Senator Blumenthal makes a good point. How would you describe the behavior here of knowing that the subsource disavows the dossier that was the primary reason you got a warrant, finding that a lawyer doctored an email to keep the investigation going in a way unfair to Mr. Page? This is not routine. Do you agree with that?
It is definitely not. It certainly better not be routine, and I don't know any reason to think it is routine.
Is it kind of off the charts bad?
It's pretty bad.
Thank you. Senator Tillis.
That's a good prelude to where I wanted to head, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Horowitz, thank you for being here. You guys do great work. I have a lot of confidence in the IGs across the whole of government, and I commend your staff for the top-notch effort here. I don't think anybody's questioning the quality of your work. I'm not an attorney. I've never argued a case before the Supreme Court. I'm not a prosecutor or solicitor general. I'm a business person, so I've been trying to figure out how the average citizen would look at this hearing and try and understand what we're trying to get to here. You've mentioned once or twice that it gets a bit, when people ask you about political motivation, when it has to do with the renewal request for the FISA warrants, you've said it gets a bit murky. And I just decided, being somebody who used to do a lot of organization charts, that I'd try and explain to the American people why this gets a little bit murky. I'm going to focus mainly on the DOJ chart. This is roughly the organization structure that was in place with the DOJ. Before I do, let's get some of the characters who were not on the DOJ org chart, although very actively involved with those who were. So I want to get this right. This started with a dossier that was paid for to be prepared by Fusion GPS by the DNC. And Steele was a part of that process. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then his primary subsource was someone who, when he was finally questioned, said they misstated or exaggerated our statements, that the alleged sexual activities were rumor or speculation, that the conversations were had with friends over beers and so on and so forth. So that was something after the dossier was used as a basis for moving forward with it. This is information that came afterwards that was known to people in this organization chart before they attested to a FISA court that the FBI found the Russian-based subsource to be truthful and cooperative. That's an accurate statement, but if they had included all the truthful and cooperative comments that he made, it would seem to me that that may have had a different effect on the renewal. It seems to me. Mm-hmm. And the omission of something as profound as this, to not infer from that there was a political motivation, or let's take politics out and say an agenda. This is something we want to get renewed. We want to continue the investigation. I don't understand as a non-attorney how that doesn't carry a fair amount of weight. Now I want to get to this organization chart. So here you can't see it, but it's on record with the DOJ. So I have Orr up here, who reports into the office of the DAG. Mm-hmm. When Steele was no longer allowed to speak with the FBI because he was shopping the dossier, I guess, to make money through the media or for whatever reason, then the FBI just conveniently accepted Orr's feedback from Steele. Now, Steele is somebody who worked for Fusion GPS on behalf of the DNC to get the dossier, which has now been largely proven false. His wife actually worked for GPS, not necessarily when the investigation was going on, but you could reasonably assume that she had relationships there. But when they cut off Steele as a source of information for the FBI, did I hear you right that multiple times the FBI seemed to warmly receive feedback from Steele through Orr?
We identified 13 occasions.
And so this guy on the org chart that's up here working for the Deputy Attorney General never communicated with any of his staff or any of his superiors that he was doing this.
That's correct.
Probably because if he asked for approval, he wouldn't have gotten.
That's essentially what he said.
So he wanted to apologize instead of ask for approval. Now I want to go to this part of the order. What the American people need to know is these aren't people that aren't walking down the hallway and in the meeting with the director of the FBI. I mean, Lisa Page right here is on this org chart. She's a special counsel to Andy McCabe. As a matter of fact, it looks like Stroke and page were in the office in roughly the time frame. This is something that's very important. This is somebody here on the org chart, somebody that works for the director of the FBI, who says he's not ever going to be president, right? This other guy on the org chart, who you'll see in a future text message, talks about a meeting with McCabe, says, no, he won't, we will stop him. And then he goes on to say, I want to believe the path that you threw out for consideration in Andy, McCabe's office, that there's no way he gets elected. But I'm afraid we can't take that risk. It's like an insurance policy in the unlikely event that you die before you're 40. These are all people that are walking the hallways involved in this investigation, having those sorts of discussions about the President of the United States, or the candidate, and then the President of the United States. Is that one of the reasons why you're being fair-minded and saying it's murky as to whether or not there was a political motivation behind some of these behaviors and the false premise for the renewals of the FISA warrants?
No, the concern grows out of the fact that all of the failures in the information that should have been given and wasn't given, and the question being, what was the intent? What was their intention, their motivation there? And what we determined was we couldn't definitively say what the motivation was.
Are these pretty smart people? Fairly well educated? At least well educated. I don't know if they're smart.
I assume so.
I don't think they were very smart, to be honest with you.
I was going to say, yeah.
They have law degrees, right? So you think
At least some of them do.
So you think the Woods Review, for people at this level of the organization,
To be clear, the stuff that didn't happen on the Woods Review was basic stuff.
Yeah.
You didn't need to be a deeply experienced FBI agent to be able to do it the right way.
Well, that's my point. So wouldn't you think that that would almost be muscle memory for people who are going through this process to know that they had an obligation to go through that?
They clearly should have.
And so wouldn't it also seem reasonable that if they didn't, you can't answer this question, but to me, it seems like if something is as standard as that process before you go to a FISA court, to not do it was something that they intended not to do. They didn't want to go through it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems to be a logical conclusion. And then you ask yourself why? Well, because we don't ever want this guy to get elected president. And if he does, it sounds like they want to impeach him. I mean, I can't understand anybody working in this organization understanding the scrutiny that we placed under the FISA courts. And by the way, Mike Lee, count me in. Because we've now seen the abuses you've warned us about. You can smirk again because you were right. But, I mean, it just seems to me that this organization, this closely held organization of highly educated, highly experienced people, I have to believe that they were handpicked for this process. They were picked because they had some of the best reputations in there. They had to know that this was going to come to this, that it was going to be scrutinized, regardless of who the subject of the investigation was. If the names were changed and the parties were changed, we'd still be here. And it looks like they were trying to skate along the edges and get away with something to me. And I can't imagine that they did it for any other reason than a political motivation. And I don't expect you to respond to that because you're doing a great job of holding to the scope of your report. But nobody can tell me, with people of this caliber, with the record of partisan, vitriolic profanity about this president, to say, whoops, we just forgot to do a standard procedural review that you would probably expect one of their staff 2 or 3 levels down to know that you need to do it. It doesn't make sense to me. Now, I want to ask you another question. You've gotten a lot of questions today that had nothing to do with your report, and I think you've done a very good job of saying, I'm here to talk about my report. You didn't do a Russia collusion investigation, did you?
We did not.
You didn't re-prosecute the special counsel report, did you?
Not.
Would you agree that you got a lot of questions today that had nothing to do with what you were here to talk about today?
I certainly had several.
Yeah. So I also wonder whether or not that was politically motivated. Let's focus on this. What I found interesting was that we do have people who are using this as a platform on the other side of the aisle that says, well, now we need to revise we need to look at the FISA process. I don't know why you'd use this as a platform to do that unless you thought that this is a clear case where the FISA process was abused. And then if you look at this information, this ecosystem of smart people who I think turned a blind eye to damning evidence to serve as a basis for renewal of the FISA reports, it's just beyond my comprehension. The weight of this evidence in your report, I think, is pretty strong. I hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, when we take up impeachment next month, have that same standard for the weight of evidence that we're going to be asked to look at. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Roanoke.
Thank you. You identified significant issues with the FISA application process for conducting surveillance on Carter Page. And before this investigation, were you aware of problems with the FBI's use of the FISA process?
I was not personally, although I will say we have done reports, as you know, Senator, for since 9/11, my office.
Well,
on
you
these
can't
issues.
sit here and tell us that these errors only occurred with regard to this FISA application process.
We've identified problems in the past. I will say we've never done a dive into one as deep as this.
As have a number of us, by the way,
Right.
Senator Lee and others of us. We understand that there are issues relating to the FISA process. And in fact, after you pointed out the errors, et cetera, the director acknowledged your findings, and in fact, he is moving ahead to make improvements to the FISA process, and as he put it, to make the FBI a much stronger institution.
That's correct.
Would you agree that it is a major decision to seek authority from a FISA court to conduct surveillance on an American?
I agree.
If FBI officials were politically motivated and wanting to conduct surveillance on a particular American, wouldn't the decision to seek FISA approval be a point where political bias could affect the process?
Could.
Yes.
Yes.
Actually, that would be a pretty good time for any kind of political bias to manifest itself. But here you found no evidence of political bias in deciding to seek FISA approval.
We did not find such evidence.
When you released your report on Monday, both the Attorney General and Mr. Durham immediately issued public statements that challenged the findings in your report. Attorney General Barr stated, quote, "The Inspector General's report now makes clear that the FBI launched an intrusive investigation of a U.S. presidential campaign on the thinnest of suspicions that, in my view, were insufficient to justify the steps taken." End quote. Can you point to the page or pages in your report that found that the FBI launched an intrusive investigation on the thinnest of suspicions that were insufficient to justify the FBI's actions?
We concluded that there was sufficient predication.
Would you consider words like the thinnest of suspicions, intrusive investigation, neutral words to describe your work?
I'm going to let others answer for their own comments and stick to what we've
Yes,
written.
you've said that everybody's entitled to characterize your investigation, but you know what? I think we all know what constitutes a fair characterization. I would say those are not fair. Yesterday, Attorney General Barr went on TV to challenge the validity of the findings of your report and suggested that his own FBI agents may have acted in, quote, bad faith or with improper motives, and that it was premature to conclude otherwise. These insinuations are inconsistent with your report. And one justification that he gave for disregarding the key finding in your report was that, unlike the investigator he handpicked, Mr. Durham, you could not compel testimony. You interviewed more than 100 witnesses for your investigation. In your report, you note you were unable to compel testimony from two people, Glenn Simpson and Jonathan Weiner. Were these the only two people for whom you couldn't compel their testimony or who wouldn't testify or talk to you?
Those were the only two people that we asked to interview that turned us down.
And do you think that the fact that you did not interview these two witnesses undermine the conclusions in your report that you found no documentary or testimonial evidence of political bias in opening the investigation or seeking FISA authority for Carter Page?
I don't believe they undermined any of our conclusions. It would have been good to have their evidence like it is normally.
Do you think that the findings in your report are inaccurate because you lacked the authority to compel witnesses?
Not in this instance, no.
In April 2019, Attorney General Barr told Congress, quote, "I think spying did occur," end quote, when talking about the FBI's investigation of the Trump campaign's ties with the Russian government in the 2016 election. And yesterday, Attorney General Barr reiterated that the Trump campaign was clearly, I'm quoting him now, clearly spied upon. He claimed the FBI's investigative actions, which you discussed in your report, constitute spying. And the word spying carries, I would say, negative connotations, don't you think?
You know,
I mean, it sounds like law enforcement is doing something they're not authorized to do, that they would spy on us.
and that's why we use and only rely on the word that's in the law, which is surveillance.
And yet we have the highest law enforcement person in our entire country using a word, not just once, but twice, using the word spying. So clearly, your report found that the FBI's investigation was for an authorized and with an adequate predicate, and you would not characterize that as spying. In fact, you would not use such a word in your report.
We don't use that
You did
in
not.
our report.
Do you think questioning the motives of your staff as possibly involving bad faith or accusing them of spying would be demoralizing to your people?
Let me put this, I would not speak to my folks about them acting in that manner.
Do you think that's a really
haven't
great
seen
way
that
to
either.
characterize what you all do in your professional capacity? I think that's a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
You know, so describing
Point
your
taken, though.
law enforcement staff's investigations as intrusive and based on the thinnest of suspicions also casts aspersions on the professionalism of your people, and I think that is probably also not terribly edifying or supportive. Did the Attorney General provide you with any evidence to support his claim that the FBI agents were spying?
In terms of evidence, we didn't get any evidence from the Attorney General. We did meet with Mr. Durham, had a discussion with him, but we, as I said, are standing by our conclusions.
Does it bother you that you have the Attorney General using words like spying to characterize what the FBI did under an authorized process?
You know, as Inspector General, I'm going to stick to what we do and what we've said and not try and guess the motives or ideas or thoughts of anyone else out there.
Yeah, I don't see you jumping up and down in glee with use of such words.
Not.
Let me go on. On November 21st, Dr. Fiona Hill, the former National Security Council Senior Director for Europe and Russia, warned that Russia has, quote, geared up to repeat their interference in the 2020 election. Even as we speak, that's what Russia is doing. She also warned Congress against promoting the fictional narrative that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 U.S. election. These conspiracy theories, she said, clearly advance Russian interests. FBI Director Wray stated on Monday that the FBI has no information that would indicate that Ukraine tried to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. And when we talk about interfere, we're talking about the kind of systemic, government-sanctioned interference with our election process that Russia engaged in. And there's no way that Ukraine engaged in that kind of systematic interference. So in all of the documents that you reviewed, 100 witnesses, did you find any evidence that contradicts FBI Director Wray's statement that the FBI has no information that indicates Ukraine tried to interfere in the 2016 election?
We didn't see any such evidence, but I emphasize that wasn't
Yes, I know.
the purpose of our
But you know what?
review.
You would think that you're looking through 1 million documents. And yeah,
Fortunately,
there might
not
have been
me, but the
something.
team. Right.
There might have been something there that referenced that maybe Ukraine was engaging in the kind of systematic interference that Russia did. I know that Senators Leahy and Klobuchar asked you about this, but I want to make it clear. Is there anything in your report that calls into question the conclusion of the Mueller report that Russia interfered in the 2016 presidential election in a sweeping and systematic fashion?
No.
And of course, we all know that the Mueller investigation resulted in 37 indictments and 6 convictions of Trump associates. Is there anything in your report that calls into question Special Counsel Mueller's conclusion that the Trump campaign not only knew about Russia's election interference, but they encouraged it and expected to benefit electorally from it?
No.
I know you receive a lot of requests from Republican and Democratic members of Congress to do certain investigations, and I've been among those. I realize you have to take certain factors into consideration because you only have so many resources to conduct all these investigations. And one of the requests that I and my colleagues asked you to investigate was whether Attorney General Barr's handling of the Mueller report was misleading and whether he demonstrated bias in dealing with the Mueller investigation. In light of the factors that I'm sure you consider, will you take another look at the request that I and my colleagues sent you to see whether you're able to investigate any of them?
So on that, Senator, first of all, I'd be happy to come up and meet with you and talk about it with you in person. Let me say I've had conversations with some of the members of the committee about this issue. It's the letters asking us to look at the conduct of senior lawyers at the department directly implicate Section 80 of the Inspector General Act, which prohibits me from looking at conduct of lawyers in their capacity as lawyers. Senator Lee has sponsored a bill that passed the House unanimously, bipartisan, full support, pending here. Several members of the committee have co-sponsored it. That provision prevents me from undertaking investigations of misconduct by senior department lawyers, or actually any department lawyers, just
Well,
to be
this
clear.
is one time when I think, agree with Senator Lee in that needing to make that kind of change to enable you to make the kind of investigation that we're asking you to make. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And again, I'd be happy to come up and talk with you about it further.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will keep doing this, and I'll apologize. Has anyone been convicted of the crime of working with the Russian government associated with the Trump campaign that you know of?
Not that I know of.
Well, they haven't. So whatever convictions have been attained got nothing to do with colluding with the Russians. That's what got us here. And about what happened here. If the government is surveilling an American citizen pursuant to a FISA warrant, and the government comes in, information is given to the government that questions the foundation of the warrant, is there an obligation to tell the court?
Absolutely.
They did not do that here, is that correct?
Correct.
As a matter of fact, they lied to the court about the information they had that was exculpatory to Mr. Page.
They gave misleading, inaccurate information.
At what point can a surveillance that started lawfully become illegal?
It can become unauthorized, inappropriate, illegal, depending upon the facts.
Would you apply all those terms to what happened in this case?
I'm going to let others who have the ability to address some of these issues decide what the precise level of intent was.
Here's what I'm going to say. It may have started lawfully. It got off the rails quick. It became a criminal conspiracy to defraud the FISA court, to put Mr. Page through hell, and to continue to surveil President Trump after he got elected. And I hope somebody pays a price for that. You've certainly done your part, Mr. Horowitz. Senator Ernst.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, Inspector General, for being here today and presenting this information. And I know that a couple others have focused on this, and I'd like to dive back in. But first, there is a lot of respect out there, or there has been, for the FBI. And I remember as a kid, watching movies or shows that portrayed the FBI, and we really thought, wow, those are the good guys. And I think what we have seen through the past number of years, number of months, is that a few bad actors have really squandered that away. And I think the American people look at the FBI and they think, wow, if they're doing this to a presidential candidate, what would they do to me as just a normal American citizen? Are they really there for me? So I'm just so sorry that this has led to this. Again, a few very bad actors. I heard somebody earlier saying, oh, the mistakes that were made at the FBI, the mistakes. It's not like, oops, I accidentally filed a FISA warrant or an application, a FISA application. Oops, that accidentally happened. That's not a mistake. It just reeks of ill ill wishes to do harm. So again, I just think the FBI, we've always thought of it as such a great institution, and now I'm looking at all this information. We've all reviewed the report, and I think, for God's sakes, what is going on here? So thank you for doing this work. I think it's just really important we take a look at what's going on, why it happened, and I'd like to focus a little more just on the discipline aspect of this, because these mistakes were made by some people that really wanted to do bad harm to an individual illegally. So Peter Strzok was fired from the FBI. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so he still has a Merit System Protection Board that is not yet adjudicated. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay. Does that mean that the termination is final or not final?
I'm going to get ahead of my legal employment law capabilities if I give you too many opinions
Okay.
on what his legal rights are in that
Okay,
regard.
very good. Thank you. It seems that there was only one individual referred for possible criminal prosecution based on the IG review, and that's the person that altered the email to imply that Carter Page was not or never a source for another agency. So with that apparent concealment of facts from the FISA court, especially as they relate to the accuracy of Steele's reporting, can you explain why there were no more criminal referrals?
What we ultimately decided was that the conduct here warranted sending the entire report to the FBI and the department for review, review from the line agent all the way to the top of people who were still at the FBI. And as we said, we didn't see documentary and testimonial evidence of intent, but we also didn't hear good explanations, which left us with an open question on what the motive was and what the state of mind was. And the adjudicative process at the FBI and the department will now assess that and look at that.
So, so we don't know of anyone else that has been fired or reassigned?
I don't know as I sit here. That would have to come from the FBI or the department.
Okay. So with that, how many case agents involved with the FISA applications in your report are still active case agents today?
As I sit here, I can't tell you the precise number. There are several who still are.
That are active.
That are still active agents. Whether they're still in certain roles or not, I don't know.
Okay, because you don't know specifically if they're still working as case agents, do you believe if they were working as case agents that the information contained in your report as it relates to those case agents should be released to other criminal defendants under the department's Giglio policy?
I think this raises those kinds of issues for the department to review and consider what they have to do to remedy any wrongs here.
And for those folks that are watching this back at home in Iowa, can you talk a little bit about the Giglio policy?
So in criminal cases, for example, when an agent is found to have engaged in misconduct, whether by a judge or by the Department of Justice, there's an obligation under a Supreme Court case called the Giglio case to notify the defendant of the wrongdoing or harm or misconduct, impeachable evidence, those sorts of things. And that obligation is taken seriously, has to be taken seriously. As I said, I've done law enforcement corruption cases as an AUSA, and one of the first things we do, including now as IG when we find issues, is notify prosecutors and the department and law enforcement to ensure that they take appropriate steps in a timely way to make sure those agents, or if it's prosecutors, but agents we're here talking about, aren't continuing to pursue cases or aren't allowed to stay in those positions if they've violated the trust that they've been given.
No, and I think that's important. The reason we're talking a little bit about this and discipline, policy, and procedures is because the American people, again, when they look at an institution like the FBI, they want to know that they are good guys. And if they are not good guys, they need to go. I think the American public gets tired of seeing bad actors with no repercussions.
very, very important from our standpoint as the Inspector General's office that there be accountability for all conduct across the board, but certainly for misconduct and performance failures, and those need to be taken into account.
Yeah, performance failures, lying. I mean, there was a lot going on in the department. They weren't just mistakes, as somebody casually mentioned. These are not just mistakes. This was bad conduct. It was intentional. So I do think that as we see this move forward, that anybody that was involved in those malicious activities is gone. So a little bit about policy and procedures, just very quickly. The IG's office has previously identified a pattern of leaks and improper contact between FBI employees and the media. Part of the decision to work the Crossfire Hurricane case out of the FBI headquarters, it does seem to be due to the fear of leaks if it were actually worked out in the field. So can you characterize how much of a problem leaks are and those unauthorized contacts between the media and members within the FBI?
So we identified this last year in our Clinton election report, the number of contacts, and we've seen it as we've done these reports subsequent to that in finding inappropriate, improper contact between agents and the media. Since our report last year, Director Wray has put out a new policy and undertaken new training to deal with that, or to try to address that and to change the culture, which is what we talked about a year ago. That the culture and the viewpoint of, in a federal criminal investigation, fairness to the defendant or the subject of the investigation, fairness to victims if there are victims, fairness to the process requires people, agents who are working these cases, to keep their head down, work the case, and not disclose information to outside parties, whether it's the media, friends, relatives, neighbors, whomever. That information has to stay in the office.
And so there has been a policy change, but what are the repercussions if someone is found guilty of engaging in those unauthorized contacts with media?
So that's one of the things we're going to follow up with the FBI on, as we've done these cases over the last year. As we've referred them, what's actually been the penalty that's been imposed? What's happened to those folks, and how is that message getting out, not just publicly, but internally, that there are going to be consequences for that? Because without the consequences, the deterrent effect goes away.
Right, absolutely. And there is no restoration of trust in the agency if there are not repercussions to those that are maliciously pursuing these types of activities. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate your team and the work that they put into the report. And in all fairness, we've got to do better. And we've got a long ways to go to restore trust in the FBI and anyone working with the FBI. So again, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Senator Harris, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Horowitz, thank you for conducting your thorough investigation into the origins of the Department of Justice's Russia investigation. So your report makes clear that the FBI had a legitimate reason to investigate the Trump campaign. Is that correct?
That's right. There was sufficient predication.
And in addition, your office found no evidence that the FBI launched a politically motivated investigation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And another key finding was that the FBI committed several errors in his applications and in their applications to surveil Carter Page.
Or maybe more than several.
And as the FBI Director Wray himself has acknowledged, your investigation found serious FBI misconduct that needs to be addressed, and Director Wray also said that the FBI fully accepts your investigation's findings. Is that correct? On the other hand, Attorney General Barr has been highly critical of your findings. During the final stages of your investigation, he even embarked on his own personal investigation by meeting with foreign leaders in foreign lands, apparently in search of evidence that contradicts the fact that Russia interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election to benefit Trump. Clearly, Barr's investigation, which was launched to do the bidding of President Trump, has two objectives. One, to undermine the integrity of our intelligence community. The goal, to cast doubt on the finding that Russia interfered in the 2016 election in order to benefit the Trump campaign, and 2, to intimidate the men and women of our intelligence community by suggesting that our national security professionals will face serious consequences if they investigate wrongdoing on the part of this president or his operatives. So, General Horowitz, I appreciate your extensive work and the work that your office has devoted to this investigation. But in addition, you have the power and the duty to investigate misconduct committed by the Attorney General of the United States, who is doing the bidding of the President to undermine our intelligence community. And I trust you take that duty seriously.
I do, and I'd just like to add that under the law, under the Inspector General Act, it carves out from my authority the ability to look at misconduct by department lawyers from the line lawyer all the way to the top and the Attorney General.
But history has also shown us that the Inspector General can participate in an investigation of the Attorney General, and that in fact happened with General Gonzalez. Do you recall that?
That happened, and it's worth noting, that happened after the Attorney General said our office was not going to get the case, that it was going to go to the Office of Professional Responsibility, and the choice for our office was whether to join that investigation or not. But that wasn't initiated through us.
So
that's the important point. The law has to change, Senator, and it should change.
So are you recommending the law?
Absolutely.
If I propose legislation that would change the law, would you support that?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's legislation Senator Lee has sponsored, several members have co-sponsored. The House has passed this unanimously.
And you would support it?
Absolutely, 100%.
Okay. So it was recently reported that the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, asked Ukrainians to help search for dirt of the political rivals of the president. In exchange for the help, Giuliani offered to help fix criminal cases against them at DOJ. Giuliani and his associates, 2 of whom have been indicted and are now in federal custody, allegedly reached out to a Ukrainian energy tycoon who faced legal problems in America. In exchange for helping find dirt on the president's political rivals, Giuliani's associates reportedly connected the Ukrainian with lawyers who could get a top-level meeting at the United States Department of Justice. In essence, Giuliani's scheme was an attempt to trade get-out-of-jail-free cards for political favors. As part of Giuliani's plan, Attorney General Barr met with the Ukrainians' lawyers, who asked that the Department of Justice withdraw evidence in the tycoon's bribery prosecution. Earlier today, you said you are not investigating matters related to ongoing Ukraine issues. Does that mean that you have decided not to investigate these incidents?
No. As I think mentioned in a recent letter, and I've been in touch with fellow IGs who've been asked by members to look at those issues. We've been in communication with each other. I think as Mr. Fine, the Defense Department IG, wrote to several members of Congress, he was foregoing at the time undertaking any work while the House investigation proceeded and any matters here in the Senate. And, as I mentioned, we will look accordingly at any action that we have the jurisdiction to review, getting back to the Section 80 discussion. No other IG has that limitation, by the way. So they can investigate their secretary, deputy secretary, administrator, whomever. I just point that out because that's important to keep in mind as we get requests. And why are we different than the State Department IG, the EPA IG, the other IGs?
Couldn't agree with you more. Do you agree that if true, Giuliani's scheme is alarming?
I think anything like that would be very concerning.
And Mr. Giuliani recently returned to Ukraine in search of dirt on the president's political rivals, apparently in order to cook up a dossier of his own. Yesterday, he told reporters that President Trump asked him to brief the Justice Department and Senate Republicans on what, if anything, he finds. Do you and are you concerned that the Justice Department would coordinate with the president's personal lawyer on a scheme clearly designed to benefit the president's political campaign?
I'm going to look at the evidence myself and facts. I've learned to, before taking any action, to not just rely on news reports or other allegations, but to actually spend the time to look at them. So I'd ask to take a look at that, and again, happy to come in and meet with you and talk with you about it.
Please do. I'd appreciate that. Is it appropriate for the Attorney General or anyone at the Department of Justice to take actions that are solely designed to benefit the President politically?
I think that would create questions about on various rules at the department and practices at the department.
During Attorney General Barr's last appearance before this committee, I asked him, has the President or anyone at the White House ever suggested that you open an investigation of anyone? Mm-hmm. After pondering the word suggest, the Attorney General declined to answer. The Attorney General's non-response suggested to many that he has opened politically motivated investigations. Indeed, we know that during a call with the President of Ukraine, President Trump said that Attorney General Barr would follow up regarding the quote-unquote favor that the President demanded. Did the Attorney General or anyone at Justice follow up with the President's call?
I don't know the answer to that question. And
Does
again,
anyone in your office know the answer to that question?
I don't believe anybody in my office would know it. And frankly, again, it gets to the question of a decision by the Attorney General whether to open an investigation or not, which in most instances, I won't foreclose it completely, but in most instances would fall squarely within the prohibition on my jurisdiction.
President Trump's phone conversation was an apparent effort to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election. And the call involved officials at multiple agencies, including the Department of Justice, the State Department, the Office of Management and Budget, and others. Are you working with the Inspectors General of these various agencies on that issue?
As I mentioned, allegations that come in, we'll talk with our fellow IGs.
On that specific one, are you working with other IGs?
We're not. I don't have any ongoing work at this point. Again, I'm not sure what my legal, if I'd have a statutory authority to look at actions by lawyers at the department related to misconduct.
Have you been approached by any other IGs to work with them on an investigation that related to that phone call?
I'll say we've had discussions generally. I don't know whether other IGs at this point have or do not have ongoing investigations.
You've had conversations generally about this phone call?
About generally Ukraine-related matters and discussions generally.
How about specifically about this phone call?
I don't recall, as I sit here, discussions about it, but again, I have to.
You have to refresh your memory?
Refresh my recollection on this issue. I've obviously been spending a fair amount of time preparing to deal with the 400-plus page report that we're talking about today.
Involving Ukraine?
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. Right. This report.
Yeah. Okay. The American system of justice was founded on the principle of equal justice under the law, and that principle obviously means that there cannot be one system of justice for one group of people and a different system of justice for others. And I have spent my career fighting for equal justice, and I'll tell you that everybody in a Department of Justice obviously has a duty to make sure that people get a fair shot. Unfortunately, recent reports suggest that the actions taken by the Justice Department leaders fall far short of their obligation to pursue equal and even-handed justice. For example, in 2011, the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel issued an opinion that paved the way for states to legalize online gambling. This opinion was opposed by Sheldon Adelson, who's a major donor who spent millions of dollars to support President Trump. And his lobbyist also sent a memo to top DOJ officials asking that the opinion be reversed. And of course, then the OLC reversed the 2011 opinion in January of 2019. Has your office investigated whether political considerations motivated the Department of Justice's abrupt reversal of online gambling?
I'm fairly confident that we would be barred from doing that by the statutory prohibition. I don't think we would have legal authority to look at why the Office of Legal Counsel made a decision one way or the other unless there was a criminal allegation connected to it.
My time is up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I join with everybody else, Mr. Horowitz, for thanking you and your team for the work that you have done here. I'm going to go back to an issue that's been talked about by many of my colleagues today, and that is this question of bias. And actually, I want to start by going back to June of 2018, when you were last here before the committee. And when I asked questions of you at that time, I talked about your findings then with regard to bias. The specific focus that I recall there was Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, and the information that's already been well presented here about what I consider to be the undeniable bias that they had against the President President Trump. At that time, you made similar statements to those you made today, which is that you did not find bias in the decisions that you were evaluating in that report. But as I went through that with you, I think that you also confirmed that you were not saying that there was no bias by those who were involved in making decisions. Rather, you were saying you could not prove that that bias was a factor in their management of the activities they engaged in on behalf of the FBI. As I understood it, you said that there was bias, but in fact that you had asked them whether their bias influenced their work performance. They had told you that it did not, and you had no contrary evidence to dispute that. Is that correct?
Let me clarify. Let me explain. We found that those text messages evidenced bias, and what we ultimately found was that other people were involved and made many of those decisions, not them, and that was the base, not because we didn't know whether they were biased. Those texts evidenced bias by them.
All right.
The question was the other individuals who we didn't have text messages for, otherwise evidence of bias by those individuals.
And that would be consistent with what your report here today says. As I'm reading from the executive summary, Deputy Attorney General, I believe that's his title, Priestap.
Assistant Director or Deputy Assistant Director, depending upon the time period.
He's the one who made the final decision to open each of the 4 investigations.
Correct.
He did that in consultation with a number of others, including Peter Strzok.
Correct.
And you don't necessarily know what advice was given in those conversations, do you?
I don't.
But he made the final decision, and because you had and you've used the phrase very consistently here today, you did not find documentary or testimonial evidence that political bias or improper motivation influenced the decision to open these 4 investigations.
Right.
Did you ask Mr. Priestap whether he had bias?
We asked all the witnesses, not just him, as to whether bias or other improper considerations had any impact. But we also looked for emails, text messages, documents that could show what we found, frankly, was Strzok and Page. I mean, if that is how you find evidence of bias. Now, beyond that, I'm stuck trying to understand what's in somebody's head if there's no other.
I just want to make it really clear what it is you are saying and what you are not saying.
Correct.
And in this case, what you're saying is that you could not find any documentary or testimonial evidence to contradict the statements of the investigators that they were not letting bias influence their decision.
Correct.
Do you believe that's an open question? I mean,
I can only speak to the evidence we found. I think the important point here, and I made earlier, is all the evidence is here. People are free to consider, evaluate what they think ultimately people's motivations were. We don't reach a definitive conclusion.
You aren't making that decision.
We're not making a decision on ultimately information, evidence we don't have that somebody may have acted.
But there's, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of most of us who have, on this side of the aisle at least, who have talked to you today, I think there's tons of evidence of bias here. In fact, you have referred for further action to the Attorney General, one case for criminal prosecution, if I understand it right, and other cases of how many other individuals?
So, but I want to be clear, we're talking now about the FISA as opposed to the opening.
I understand, and there is a distinction between the opening of the investigation and the conduct of the investigation.
Correct.
And so I'm moving, I understand that. In fact, I appreciate
I've tried to separate
that
those
clarification. Because in the conduct of the investigation, hence bias. But you're not making that judgment. I understand that. You're referring that to the Attorney General, correct?
Mm-hmm. And the FBI for adjudication, consideration
and the FBI,
of this.
Understood. And I believe in response to Senator Ernst's question on this same issue, you indicated that similarly, since you could not find any documentary evidence or testimonial evidence to contradict their statements that they were not biased, that leaves an open question as to what the FBI or the Attorney General will find with these referrals.
There are significant serious failures here on the operation of the, particularly in connection with the FISAs, whether it was sheer gross incompetence that led to this versus intentional misconduct and what the anything in between and what the motivations are, I can't tell you.
You're not making that decision.
I can't tell you as I sit here today because I don't have enough evidence to reach a conclusion.
But if someone were to characterize what you are telling us to be that you're telling us there is no bias here, that's not what you're telling us.
That is not as to the operation of these FISAs what I'm telling you.
All right, understood. And I did want to get to this question, though, about the operation of the FISAs. And again, you may not answer this, and that's fine. But it seems to me that if we go beyond the bias question to intentional versus grossly negligent, it seems to me that the kind of misconduct that has been presented by you and reviewed by our chairman and many others here today is mind-numbing to consider that it could be just accidental. Can you reach a conclusion like that?
I'd be skeptical, but I understand why people would be skeptical of that. There is such a range of conduct here that is inexplicable, and the answers we got were not satisfactory, that we're left trying to understand how could all these errors have occurred over a 9-month period or so among 3 teams, handpicked, one of the highest profile, if not the highest profile case in the FBI, going to the very top of the organization involving a presidential campaign.
Well, I understand that. I appreciate that. I think it is explicable. But I understand that you can't, or at least aren't going to make that jump. You are going to refer these cases. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that. Is criminal prosecution a possible action in the cases other than the one you've specifically referred?
I wouldn't want to prejudice or prejudge anything. I'd leave it to the department to speak to you on that.
All right. Let me go on for just a moment. Let's move to the whistleblower question just once more. I'm shifting topics completely. It's come up several times today, and I understand your point that a whistleblower is entitled to anonymity. Mm-hmm. Explain to me how it happens that the person accused, when a whistleblower makes an accusation, can have the right that most Americans think they should have to confront those testifying against them. How is that accomplished?
So I'll speak to what we do. We get anonymous allegations frequently. We get people coming forward who are reporting misconduct who want to be anonymous, want to stay anonymous. So we get them both ways. We get people walking in saying, keep me anonymous, and anonymous complaints. We move forward on both if we think they're sufficient to move forward on and predicated and have support. But we then have to prove the allegations and get corroboration for it, because you're right, the individual, if there is a finding of misconduct, has a right to ultimately challenge the evidence found. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they get all the way back to where the nugget started if that information is corroborated through other means. And the IG Act requires us, actually, the law says, and Senator Grassley obviously has had a role in this, makes it quite clear. We are not, unless we're legally obligated to provide the information, the law requires us to do so. It's our obligation as IGs to keep that information.
Well, I appreciate that, because as you know, we may face that question here in the Senate relatively quickly. Last quick question, and I'm running out of time, so I just would like a quick answer if you could. I'm trying to find out who brought the Steele dossier to the attention of the FBI for the investigation. Was that Andrew McCabe or was that Bruce Orr?
So it was Steele in July 5th of 2016 going to his handling agent. The agent, there's a dispute whether he was a confidential source or not. We spend a number of pages on this. But the agent that Steele had a relationship with is the agent he went to with some of his reports. That agent then put it through a process at the FBI, and it then took from July 5th to September 19th to get the information to the Crossfire Hurricane team. Eventually, in that meandering over the, what is that, 2.5 months, there's information that we conclude in here that Mr. McCabe was involved in referring it over to the Crossfire Hurricane team.
All right, thank you.
Long day, General. You've got sturdy kidneys.
Hopefully for 20 more minutes.
Yes. I'm going to try to land this plane early. I believe the FBI is the premier law enforcement agency in all of human history. Would you disagree with that?
I would not.
But clearly, we've got some bad apples.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you, and I want to thank your team for your usual superb job. After I haven't read the entire report. I'm about 70% of the way through, but I'm going to finish it. It's tedious.
Yes.
I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. It's supposed to be tedious.
Right.
After about 15% of the way through, it made me want to heave. After about 25% of the way through, I thought I'd dropped acid. It's surreal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just couldn't believe it.
I've read it multiple times, and every time I read it,
Let me ask you this. How many members comprised the misfire hurricane team?
Mm-hmm. There were 3 teams over that period of time. I would venture to guess, again, depending on how you count them.
Just roughly.
At least half a dozen to a dozen on each of those iterations. I'll turn around and see if I'm somewhat close.
Does that include their supervisors?
Generally
All of
speaking.
them. Half dozen to a dozen?
And probably a little bit more if you're going to go all the way
Okay.
up the chain through all the different levels at the Bureau.
Do you or your team have a feel for how many of these folks are still at the FBI? I know you tried to answer that. Does anybody know that?
Well, the higher level people, as you know, have changed over in the last year. So the director, deputy director, et
Right.
cetera, the assistant director, deputy assistant director, a lot of people at the upper levels are no longer.
But are some
with
of the
Bureau.
actual agents,
Some of the agents are still there. Some
are
of the
they still
first-line
working on
supervisors.
FISA applications?
I would encourage you to speak to the FBI about that.
Yeah, well, I
I
think
think
we
they
will.
have.
Yeah, I think we will.
I think they've taken some steps in that regard, I
It's
understand.
it's easier to divorce your spouse around here than it is to get fired. That's clear, at least at the FBI. Is Mr. Orr still at the Department of Justice?
That my understanding is he is.
He's still there?
That's my understanding.
How long within the FBI, I know you just issued your report, but how long within the FBI has this been knowledge?
So we sent the draft for classification.
Not
end of
your
August.
document, excuse me
Oh,
for
I'm sorry.
interrupting, but just the fact that there was a major league screw-up here.
It evolved over time. They did not know a lot of this until we found it.
But they
So,
know
for
it
example,
now,
the
right?
altered email, they
Chris
didn't know
Wray
that.
knows it now, though, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay,
That's what I was saying, as of the end of August.
all right. Does your report vindicate Mr. Comey?
It doesn't vindicate anyone at the FBI who touched this, including the leadership.
Does it vindicate Mr. McCabe?
Same answer.
How about Ms. Page?
A little different there because, as we found here, she wasn't involved in this, so I actually don't, it largely wasn't involved in this, so.
She participated in the
In some discussions, but was not in the FISA chain, which is.
On that note, who briefed the agent that was sent to surveil Michael Flynn during the meeting with President Trump?
That was discussed up and down the chain at the FBI.
Okay.
So that was not a hidden fact or hidden information.
All right. I like the fact that you and your team are very precise in your language. Frankly, I wish I wrote as well as you and your team do. And I noticed you were careful to say, I'm going to quote here, "We did not find documentary or testimonial evidence that political bias or improper motivation influenced the decisions to open the 4 individual investigations." Your words.
Correct.
No documentary evidence and no testimonial evidence. So you didn't find any documents that said, we did this to get Trump, right?
Or text messages
Right.
like the struck page
Right.
text messages.
And nobody who was involved in this circus without a tent looked you in the eye and said, yep, I did it to get Trump. Nobody did that.
Or, for example, a whistleblower come in or other people
Right.
tell us they
But none
heard
of
something
the
like
agents you
that.
talked to looked you in the eye and said, yeah, you're right, I did it to get Trump.
And nobody came in through a different means and said, I've got a problem here with this, what's going on.
I mean, you don't have to qualify as Mensa material to know not to do that to the Inspector General, right?
Yes, although, look at some of the text messages we found. So I'm not sure.
I understand.
That may be a counter narrative to that.
Well, I don't want to get too, I don't know what's the word, epistemological here, but is the absence of evidence always the evidence of absence?
No, it isn't.
So can you rule out categorically, unequivocally, and unconditionally that there was no bias here by the fact that you didn't find anything in writing and none of these chuckleheads looked you in the eye and said, yeah, I did it to get Trump?
Well, yeah, it's rare that I could tell you at any point in time, I could unequivocally 100% say this actually happened. So I get it. I will say that somewhat the difference on the opening is we concluded, based on the evidence, that Mr. Priestap opened it. We have not seen in last year's investigation or this investigation, looking through texts, emails, et cetera, talking to other people, any evidence that he did it for a improper purpose. Can I tell you 1,000% someone won't walk in a week and say, aha, you missed this? But that's what I'm saying.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Let's talk about the people involved in the initial FISA application and the renewals. These are experienced people, right?
In this case, these were experienced people.
Many of them had professional degrees, include but not limited to law degrees, right?
I actually don't know what all their degrees were.
Okay. They knew the law.
They should have not only known the law, they should have known every single policy that they had to deal with here.
I mean, they were handpicked by Mr. McCabe, right?
They were handpicked.
Okay. This wasn't their first rodeo.
It certainly wasn't, with maybe an exception or two towards the end, of relatively new agents coming on board.
Well,
but that to me, should not have been an excuse, just to be clear.
Well, it just seems to me that it has to be one or two things, either incompetence or intentional conduct.
I agree. It's either sheer incompetence, intentionality, or something perhaps in between.
So which do you think it is?
We've got so many different people here. First of all, it wouldn't be fair to lump everybody into one because there are different actors coming in at different times. Some people have more touches of this than others. I think it's fair for people to sit there and look at all of these 17 events and wonder how it could be purely incompetence. Okay.
Well, I want to thank you again. I know this puts you in a tough spot. And I hope you'll tell your colleagues back at the FBI that we appreciate their work.
Absolutely.
But this got to be fixed.
Yeah.
At a minimum, somebody's got to be fired.
Yeah.
Agree completely. There's got to be a change in the culture also.
I'm done.
Agreed. Thank
I'm
you.
done, Mr. Chairman.
Excellent. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General, I know you're happy to see the end of the dais coming at you. You're going to get out of here. Let me pick up right where Senator Kennedy left off, because I will tell you the perception by the American people from reading your report, and we've all put up links so that people can read it, is that this was intentional, that it was deliberate, that it was malicious, it was premeditated and well thought out, and that it is conducted by people who were desperate. In essence, it is the epitome of the swamp. It is murky and muddy, and people weren't going to get their way, and this guy who was going to win and then did win didn't deserve to win. And it does have the appearance of intentionality, because you would not have this series of unfortunate coincidences. That is not what it is. It is the surveillance state at work. This is what they did. And they took their professional place and those tools that they had at their disposal to go spy on a campaign and on U.S. citizens, which is unbelievable. And you've heard it from several today that people can't believe this happened. And you can say, yes, there are sins of omission here, but there are also sins of commission. And they were deliberate and intentional and very malicious in the way they went about this. I want to talk a little bit about Christopher Steele. I was looking in Appendix A, I think it's page 419, and it says in there he was paid $95,000 over a 3-year period of time, I believe.
Correct.
Okay, and what was that money paid to him for?
So that would have been for various pieces of information that he gave to the FBI after being a CHS in 2013.
All right.
But not related to be clear, not related to Crossfire Hurricane.
Correct.
Between 13 and 16.
Right. He was considered a trusted source, and thereby he was paid.
Correct.
Okay, and then he began working with Fusion GPS in June of 2016, and that really should have raised some alarm bells with you all. November comes along of that year, and you drop Steele as a source, correct?
Well, the FBI drops Steele.
Yes, the FBI drops him. He wasn't trusted anymore, and that was because he blew his cover.
Correct.
Started talking to the media, and they should have stopped relying on him at that point, correct?
Under FBI rules, once you're closed, you're closed. You need certain approvals to start reinitiating and reengaging.
That's right. But the FBI kept using him, correct?
They met with him through Bruce Orr.
Yes, and they used him for information after he was cut off.
They received that information.
Right, 13 different times.
Correct.
Correct, okay. So then we get this dossier. It is used as a big part of setting up this entire process for the FISA application. And Christopher Steele, people at the FBI know Christopher Steele was untrustworthy. He was an untrustworthy foreign actor. He was a political hack. He didn't like Trump. He was being paid by the Clintons, but they still pushed forward with using him and exercised extremely poor judgment, correct?
Certainly, once they found out that he had done, they had decided to close him, they should have followed the rules if they wanted to re-engage with him, but they had plenty of information to question the validity and the bona fides of some of the reporting.
Should Bruce Orr be held criminally responsible for his conduct?
We make a recommendation to the department.
And that's for others to make.
Others will make the decision.
Let me ask you, a couple of times we've heard about lower level FBI agents and lawyers who had generated some of these inaccuracies, these 17 inaccuracies. So what is the process for supervisors fact-checking?
So under the Woods procedures, these factual accuracy procedures put in place in response to prior instances found of the failure to accurately relay information to the court, the first-line supervisor is supposed to go through and recheck the process to make sure it was done. That did not happen here.
And
on multiple occasions.
Right. And why did that not happen on these multiple occasions that this work was not checked?
Because we were given explanations ranging from a lack of understanding of the process to
so they were trying to skirt not only the rules but the law.
We got a lot of explanations that we didn't find particularly satisfactory.
That they were skirting the law. I think what they did to Carter Page, as you have heard, is just unbelievable. Let me ask you this: how often do you find mistakes in a FISA application?
Well, this is actually the first time my office has done a deep dive into a particular application. We've done higher level reviews on the FISA process and have found various issues at a higher level, but this is the first time we've actually been able to delve in this way to a FISA.
It's a fairly unusual occurrence.
Let me put this, I would hope so.
If it's not an unusual occurrence, there are more cultural problems than you know about at the FBI, correct?
That's correct.
I would say so, too. Okay. I want to touch on accountability in the short amount of time that I have left, because I think it is absolutely just infuriating to the American people that those who executed this exercise, which should have been called Operation Takedown Trump, because that's what they were doing, that they are still getting a taxpayer-funded paycheck, they're still getting taxpayer-funded benefits and vacation time. When they take off for Christmas, they're going to be on the taxpayer dime. And you know, around here, from time to time, you'll hear people talk about those that went after the late Senator Stevens. One of them still working for the U.S. Attorney's Office up in Anchorage. Another one is working in Spokane. Senator Stevens was found to be innocent, and they're still getting a government paycheck. So we want to make certain that disciplinary action is taken. I know you were asked about case agent number 1. He is still there. What about SSA 1, who did the security briefing? Still employed?
That's my understanding.
Okay, so he is still using our money to fund his lifestyle. And the lawyer, we know, is going to have face criminal referrals, correct?
I'm just going to stick with what we say in here, which is we referred it to the Attorney General and the FBI Director.
Okay. The FBI sent a supervisory, no, I don't want to ask you that. We know, I think we know the answer to that. Peter Strzok approved the request to expedite the first FISA application, and he, along with Lisa Page, pushed for the expedition of the first application with DOJ officials, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So we know that she was, in answer to what Senator Kennedy asked you, she was involved in the line of communication and the setup of this, correct?
She was involved in at least the one meeting that we identify in the report.
Okay. And I found it curious in your report, and this is the reason I ask it. You said that they had no role in the preparation of the approval of any of the 4 FISA warrant applications. So I guess if you're saying not putting pen to paper and giving a nod or an up or down.
They were not in the, there's a substantial chain of approval that has to go on at the FBI. They were not in the chain that had to sign off on it, but they did get involved, as you indicated, in pushing the department to get answers to,
so they were
can we move
involved in the
forward?
process, but just not
In that way.
final approval.
They did not have responsibility at any step of this for signing.
Okay, we're going to get you out of here maybe a few seconds early. I just want to thank you and your team very much for the patience, for being here, for the report that you've given. I think that many of us look forward to what General Durham is going to say when he takes up some of this. But I think it's important to note also, this is not the first time something has happened like this. in one of our federal agencies. And the reaction when I'm at home in Tennessee from people is they cannot believe the absolute maliciousness that took place with this. It is not unfortunate coincidences. It is the surveillance state. Yield back.
And if I could just thank you also. You mentioned Senator Stevens and the bill that Senator Lee has pending that you co-sponsored and joined. I appreciate your support for our work. Thank you.
We're truly near the end. Senator Hirano has one question.
One question. Thank you so much, Mr.
Great.
Chairman. So, Mr. Horowitz,
Yeah.
you are investigating for 19 months, 100 witnesses, 1 million documents. You even have a hotline for whistleblowers.
Right.
So did any whistleblowers come forward during your investigation with any concern that errors were made intentionally or out of bias against Trump? I mean, for example, I'm looking at the footnote on page 339 of your report, and it cites some of the very colorful pro-Trump tweets that were made by some of the FBI agents. One would think that if they knew anything, they would have contacted you in the 19-month investigation that you conducted. Did anybody come forward?
We did not have any such evidence.
So no documents, no testimony, no one coming forward to complain. That would be another way of gauging motives, as you put it, correct?
Correct.
No one came forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I probably violated the Geneva Convention today. I mean, you sit there 4 hours and not give you a bathroom break. I really appreciate what all of you did. This is a well-documented report. There's sort of a blue team, red team view to some extent, but I'm sort of glad to see all of us coming together that this should never happen again. The FISA system to survive has to be reformed. To the FISA court, we're looking to you to take corrective action. If you take corrective action, that will give us some confidence that you should stick around. If you don't, it's going to be hurtful to the future of the court. I think all of us are now thinking differently about checks and balances in that regard. The country would be stronger. Let me just end with where I began. Rather than debating whether or not there was a legal predicate, reasonable articulation, which is a very low standard, to open up a preliminary investigation. Durham will have his view of what really happened. He may know more than you. I don't know. I trust him to be fair. I trust you to be fair. The fact that 3 lawyers disagree is okay. No one's ever suggested y'all did a bad job. You've done a great job. You can reach your conclusion about the legal predicate, and you have, and I respect it. And I'm going to assume for a moment that's the right conclusion. That doesn't matter at all to me, because after it was opened, it became a nightmare. It became something that can never happen again. Conspiracy to defraud the court. It became an effort by, and I respect it. And I'm going to assume for a moment that's the right conclusion. That doesn't matter at all to me, because after it was opened, it became a nightmare. It became something that can never happen again. It became, over time, a criminal conspiracy to defraud the court. It became an effort by lawyers to doctor evidence. It became a conscious effort to deny the court exculpatory information about an American citizen. They should have stopped, at least in January 2017, when the Russian subsource said, everything in the dossier I disavow. Poor Carter Page. 2 more warrant renewals after they were on notice the dossier was unreliable. All I can say is that why they did it, you can make your own decision. But it's pretty clear to me that this was a lot of things, but it was not a counterintelligence investigation to protect Donald Trump. This was opened as a counterintelligence investigation, and it kept going and going and going after it should have stopped, because the last thing on their mind was to protect Donald Trump. A lot of the key players here were upset with the outcome of the 2016 election. And man, they had a lot of power. And that's what worries me the most. You may not like what the American people do, but you should honor their decision. And the reason the investigation survived and kept going after so many stop signs is because people wanted it to keep going. The reason nobody briefed Donald Trump about you may have people working for you connected to Russia is they could give a damn about protecting him. This is just my view. It's kind of odd that in a counterintelligence investigation, you never briefed the person who's the subject of the foreign influence, like you did Dianne Feinstein and like they did Hillary Clinton. So the bottom line here is, I hope we never have a defensive briefing or intelligence briefing where you send an FBI agent to do a 302 on the people you're briefing. This is some really scary stuff. I think I know what their motivation was, but it doesn't matter. They did it. Hope somebody holds them accountable. And I hope it never, ever happens again. To my Democratic friends, this could happen to you one day. Mr. Horowitz, do you agree that every politician in America should be concerned about what happened here?
I'll go further. Every American should want to make sure this FISA process works the right way.
Finally, to those of us in politics, how easy it is for somebody to come in our lives and our campaigns as volunteers. And I would hope the FBI would tell me if they've got a reasonable suspicion that somebody in my campaign is a bad actor, so I can do something about it. What scares me the most is that the power to open up a counterintelligence investigation is almost unlimited. The power to abuse it is exactly what your report tells us about. Thank you. The hearing's adjourned. And finally, this is the beginning, not the end, of this committee's involvement in this matter. Much more to follow. Thank you.
Ashcroft actually changed that and gave us the authority over DEA and FBI. Congress codified it in 2002, but attorneys still a carve out. We're the only IG that can't review conduct of all the employees in our organization, including